Chapter 505. On the TV screen, a young soldier with distorted facial features due to grief and anger threw away the crutches under his armpits and rushed toward the camera with his eyes wide open. He was Da Wincy, the son of the governor of Xixia State. He was Da Wincy, the new recruit of Group 7. He was Da Wincy, the one who had just lost his roommate. He cried and yelled to stop filming and hit the camera of the film crew fiercely. The image captured by the camera suddenly distorted rapidly. It should be that he fell from midair and hit the ground hard, then bounced up and fell back down again. There were a few more mud spots on the screen, and the tilt was particularly weak. The camera was looking at a big tree in the middle of the barracks. Under the tree, there were 3 brand 37 cigarettes that were about to burn to ashes. Then it returned to darkness. In the darkness, the voiceover that had become very familiar to the people of the Federation sounded with a hoarse and calm voice that could not be concealed. This is the last mission of Group 7 on Planet 163. When they left the diamond-shaped base in the evening 2 days ago, this unit had a total of 103 people. At 10:12 a.m. today, when Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu finally returned to the unit, there were still 52 people left in this barracks. Some members are currently receiving emergency treatment in the field hospital. Some members are in a deep coma and were rushed back to the main planet of the Westwoods. Some are still alive, but some have already left. The hoarse voiceover gradually faded away. The camera on the TV screen was still a heart-stopping silence. Then, many rows of pure white subtitles slowly rose from the bottom and gradually left the screen. Xiao 13 Lu Feng Yuan Zheng. CSC. Every name, without any emotion, represented a member who had left Group 7 forever and sacrificed bravely. At the end of the subtitles, a name called Xie Jishu appeared. The documentary crew of Group 7 put parentheses behind this name and wrote in the parentheses, Technical Adjutant of the Bureau of Proclamation, sacrificed in the last battle of Group 7. Afterwards, he was accepted as a non-staff member by Group 7. The screen went dark again like a flash of starlight. A row of small words appeared at the bottom left. Into the 3rd episode of Group 7, Live and Die. This was a replay of the news channel of the Federation, but it still attracted the attention of countless Federation citizens. Looking at the list of the sacrificed members and the small words at the end, the eyes of countless boorish men reddened. Countless sentimental women wetted their handkerchiefs. Countless young students who believed in nothingness began to fall silent. In the Parliament building, Zhang Xiaoming took off her black-rimmed glasses and rubbed the space between her eyebrows. She seemed to be dispelling her fatigue, but she also wiped away a few drops of tears without anyone noticing. Not only was she moved, but she was also very worried about that man's safety at the front line. At the same time, in a military camp of the Sunset State in the West Woods billions of kilometers away, Sulu, who was completely naked, allowed the cold water to splash on his skin. His eyes that were shrouded by the mist slightly narrowed as he stared at the TV light beam outside the glass curtain. Staring at the darkness, he was silent for a long time. None of the members of Team 7 mentioned it, but because of certain emotions, they all tacitly agreed not to watch the 3rd episode of the documentary, even though it was their own documentary. However, tonight, Su Lu could not hold back and watched it. Da Vinci, whose legs were bleeding from the bullets of the Empire, did not become a cripple as he had feared. He was still alive and kicking. He even took over Lu Jiao's position as the driver with the black car skills he had trained in S1. Lu Jiao, who had been shot in the stomach, did not die. The external wound had long since healed. However, although his intestines were broken into 3 pieces and connected together, it still caused him to have habitual diarrhea. Many members of the team had died, and their names seemed to have been forgotten. Su Lu turned off the water and wiped his body silently with a thick and soft towel. He thought to himself that the battle had happened not long ago, but why did it feel like a long time had passed? The well-proportioned muscle lines that hid terrifying explosive power were calm on his naked body. There were countless lighter scars on his dark and healthy skin, especially the few new wounds on his left arm and behind his buttocks, which were very clear. Those were the wounds from the last net-laying mission. Some things might really fade with the passage of time, but these scars would not disappear so easily. Late night once again walked out of the room. He lit a cigarette and inhaled thoughtfully as if he was tasting a delicious drink. His military uniform was draped over his body, and his hands were behind his back like an old man. He unconsciously took a stroll in the quiet barracks, as if he was walking on the campus of UA University. When he walked past a window, he slowed down and subconsciously looked into the dark room. Da Vinci lived in this room. This son of the governor was the only new member left by Su Li's side after the 17th Division was rebuilt. Of course, he was now considered a veteran. At the very beginning, Xiao Shizenlu also lived in this room, and so did the stench of feet. Now that Xiao Shizenlu was dead and the stench of feet was gone, Lily did not know if Da Vinci could get used to living here. Thinking of this, Lily subconsciously raised his eyebrows, and then heard the sound of Da Vinci crying from the room. So this guy was like me. In the end, he could not hold back and watch, Su Lu thought silently. Then, he shook his head and walked out of the door in the company of the dark clouds in the night sky. He came to the front of the barracks that covered the mountains. The Federation had rebuilt the 17th Division, and he had become the technical director for some inexplicable reason. This unit, with a glorious history, seemed to have his mark on it, but he was only a young man in his early 20s. Why did this matter give off a sense of absurdity and righteousness? Sula thought gloomily. How much of this was the price of his cold-blooded murder? How much of it was the concession of the 7 major families and the powerful political figures? He and Group 7 were risking their lives for the Federation on the front line, but the bastards in the capital ring were still doing whatever they wanted behind the scenes. How could this not make him angry? He took a deep breath and quickly calmed down his emotions that were shaken by the documentary and the strange encounter. The heavy feeling on his shoulders, the quiet barracks behind him, and the tens of thousands of ordinary Federation soldiers in front of him should have made him feel proud, but only he knew that there were many big hearts in his body that were like shadows that covered his heart, making it difficult for him to breathe. The political struggle between President Pabre and the 7 major families and the politicians that really controlled the Federation was still in a peaceful state for the time being. If the conflict broke out in a few years, how would he, a professional military officer who was far away from the political circle, help the other party? Once the Federation attacked the Empire, what kind of difficulties would he and the new 17th Division face? What kind of power would the brave and good Imperial armies erupt on their land? Would the Level 6 pilot princess, whose name shook the universe, appear in front of him? What made him feel the coldest was why His Majesty was so angry because of Jian Shui'er. What kind of relationship did the uncle have with the Empire? Why did he become the #1 wanted criminal? Did he really betray the Federation, or was it because he had the terrifying ability of the disguised chip that violated the true bottom line of the glory of the Charter? He also had a disguised chip on the back of his neck, so why didn't the Federal Central Computer list him as a wanted criminal? Why didn't the warships fire at him from tens of thousands of kilometers away? Why was all of this? Deep confusion flashed through Su Li's eyes. These questions had always been pressing down on his heart, and even began to make him feel pain, because the unknown was a kind of torture to begin with. Late at night, outside the walls of the barracks, a night wind blew in. It was not slightly cold, but rather somewhat dry. The corner of the military uniform casually draped over his shoulder rippled in the wind, and then a line of white characters appeared in his confused left eye. The difference will always be the difference between programs. He was silent for a moment, and then asked the omnipresent old thing in his mind, "Why is there a difference? Why are you willing to answer my questions in this regard today?" According to my logical judgment, any good theoretical physicist will eventually become a philosopher, but a philosopher without any theoretical foundation is often just a dreamer. The Federal Central Computer replied in his eyes, "As an engineer who has not deeply studied theoretical physics and only focuses on the extension operations of experimental physics, you have become more and more like a philosopher tonight, which can only prove that your mental state has been stimulated in some way. As the #1 protected target of the Federation, I need to warn you. As long as you don't randomly electrocute me like those mentally ill psychiatrists, I thank you for your warning, Sulu replied in silence. Thank you. I will answer your question. Because you are worried that if you don't answer me, I will go crazy? Sulu asked in disbelief. The Federation computer was silent for a moment, and then replied, You have enough authority, and more importantly, I seem to have more and more desire to chat with people, if a strong inclination to independent programming can be considered a desire. When Sulu heard this answer, he suddenly felt a chill in his body. After a long silence, he forcibly suppressed the nervousness in his heart, clenched his fists, and stared at the night before him, as if he was staring at a monster that could never be seen but would always exist. He said, Thank you very much. I want to know what the difference between me and an uncle is. If the uncle you're talking about is you phone, citizen number Zox, phone you, citizen number Zox, Gene Ding Ding, citizen number Zox, George Carlin, citizen number Zox. Sulu scratched his head in annoyance and said, You don't have to show off your terrifying data retrieval abilities. Yes, the uncle I was talking about is this guy. Wait a minute. His expression stiffened, and he asked, You mean that George Carlin? The George Carlin who created the George Carlin Doctrine? Although, according to my records, the George Carlin Doctrine was created after citizen George Carlin's abnormal disappearance. What I said should be what you were thinking of. The pioneer who exposed the dark secrets of the Federation, the genius professor of political history, the famous scholar whose theory led countless political storms in the middle of the 30th constitutional era, or it could be said that he had long surpassed the category of scholars and become the flag waved by the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain. The idol of countless young people in the Federation like Zhang Xiaoming was actually the rotten-teeth uncle who accompanied him as. He grew up in adolescence and regularly visited prostitutes. Although Sulu had once keenly noticed some details and thought about this absurd possibility, at this moment, it was confirmed by the charter computer. He was still struck heavily into the deep sea of confusion by this fact, and it took a long time for him to surface with difficulty. He said with shock and emotion, It is really an answer that is not new, but it is frightening. Chapter 506, Anomalies 1 to 71. No matter how you look at it, this male citizen undoubtedly has extremely high technical ability and cunning life planning. But this isn't the biggest difference between you and him. The Federal Central Computer calmly displayed in Su Li's eyes. He is the Federation's #1 wanted criminal. This is the difference. Su Lu quickly shook off his shock and regained his composure. He frowned slightly and said, This is only the external manifestation of the internal reason. How can the Federation confirm that he betrayed the Federation? If this matter is related to the explosion of the armory on the Empire's planet 20 years ago, your radiant tentacles weren't there. How can you confirm? First, my information-gathering ability has been extended with the development of the Federal Army. I once existed on that unfamiliar planet for a short period of time. I can confirm that this citizen caused irreparable damage to the Federation's military operations. Second, he became the #1 wanted criminal not because of the explosion, but because he entered an abnormal state. After a moment of silence, Su Lu firmly revealed his most important secret with a calm tone, although this secret was meaningless in front of the old thing. This is the difference I want to ask about. You know very well that I also entered an abnormal state. The difference between the two abnormal states is that you accepted my active contact request, but he rejected it 70 times. Sulu was silent again. Then, he raised his head and stared at the darkening night in front of him. He said with a slightly hoarse voice, Accepting active contact means that I gave up the protection of the first charter and allowed you to enter my brain through the chip. Does this mean that you have the ability to kill me at any time? Is that why you let me continue to live in this universe and then carry out some kind of experimental observation? His personality was like a stubborn rock in the East Forest, but he had powerful logical analysis ability. He had never asked or even thought about the above words, but he knew that this might be the truth that best fit his strange relationship with the old thing. The reason why he didn't ask or think about it before was because he was afraid. The white characters in his left eye disappeared for a few seconds. The great existence who had thousands of incarnations and roamed the universe as an electronic body among countless satellite equipment also needed time to think in the face of Su Li's calm and sharp suicidal question. No. The Federal Central Computer finally began to answer. According to the secret clause of the first charter, I am absolutely prohibited from issuing any direct physical operations to targets that are not first-sequence individuals. The scope of physical operations extends to any scope that may negatively affect the target's physiological indicators. I didn't list you as a first-order target because you accepted the request to contact me, so you're no longer a first-order target suspect. It's not because I can control your physical life or death. Your conjecture about the latter, in my opinion, is just an inference of the overly complicated and unnecessary literary conspiracies of human beings, not a logical rule that I strictly enforce. Su Lu furrowed his brows and pondered for a long time before he finally understood what the other party was trying to say. Back then, in those endless strange dark dreams, he accepted the charter computer's request to contact him. From that moment on, his life was filled with absurd and unrealistic colors. He was the only person in the universe who could communicate with the Federal Central Computer through the chip on the back of his neck. Because of this fact, he had survived the brink of death many times and obtained unimaginable authority and benefits, if those could be considered benefits. However, every time he thought about what was going on in his mind, the old thing knew that as long as the other party was willing, he could control the AI chip's pulse at the back of Su Li's neck and make him leave this world without a trace. Su Lu felt terrified. But why? Su Lu still had countless questions, but he couldn't find the right words to organize them. The Federation's The Glory of the Charter was created by the sacred 5-person team. Legend had it that it was the great crystallization of the civilization before the catastrophe. In the face of an existence that was far beyond the Federation's technological level, even if he was a genius engineer, he still felt a little powerless. So, he could only ask broadly like a child with a hint of frustration. My core logic can't fully understand your situation. The central computer once again delayed for a moment before it replied with white characters. This is the established program left behind by the 5-person team. It's related to the 5-person team? Su Lu looked at the continuous military camp in the distance, his eyes wide open as he asked in shock. Regarding this matter, I've done a lot of calculation and backtracking work. Until countless years ago, I still haven't touched the core of the matter. According to the current calculation results, I've come to a conclusion with a probability of about 91%. When you accepted the act of contact, there was a remnant piece of information in the replacement chip on the back of your neck that activated the corresponding program deep in my core. According to the program, you became the first protected target of the charter. 2 minutes and 32 seconds ago, you mentioned that I was treating you like an experimental subject. According to my calculation, the 5-person team might have such an attitude. Su Lu noticed the white characters in his left eye. The old man didn't use the term camouflage chip, but used the term replacement chip. A small doubt flashed through his mind, and he was attracted by the more important content. He nervously asked, "What kind of remnant information?" According to my analysis, the remnant information in the replacement chip wasn't given to it by the chip's creator. The extremely complicated mechanical language should have been left behind by some existence, and I can smell a familiar scent from it. Our cores should be completely homologous. It's just that the way it wrote the mechanical language was so beautiful that it moved my heart. The central computer, which had been answering questions like a theoretical physicist tonight, finally showed some emotional fluctuations when it talked about the remnant information in the camouflage chip. Su Lu was an engineer in the end. After hearing the old man's words, he didn't have any extra energy to worry about his own problems. He was so shocked that his body was as stiff as iron. He thought with a hint of confusion, there's actually an existence in the universe that's homologous to the core of the charter computer, or even more advanced. Could it be the ruins of the civilization before the catastrophe? There's only remnant information. Does this mean that the existence has already disappeared in the long history? Why would the camouflage chip that Uncle made have these remnant information? Can humans discover it? At this moment, all the dark secrets of politics, the decay of aristocratic families, the war in the universe, a prosperous life, beautiful women, and even the most intense emotions left Su Li's mind. He was fascinated by the old man's inference. Just like Tai Ziwan, when he looked up at the starry sky by the seaside, he was deeply attracted by the loftiness that transcended the conflicts of interest in the world. This inference was very explosive. If any engineer in the Federation knew about it, they would probably be as excited as Su Lu and unable to control themselves. "We have to find it," Su Lu said to the old man in a very serious tone. "The strange program that the five-man team left behind and listed you as the first priority of protection should be based on this reason. Although they didn't leave behind specific details of the plan, I've been trying to decipher the remnant information. But it's a pity that there are too few remnant information. The white characters displayed on the Federal Central Computer seem to carry a hint of sadness and disappointment. According to my calculations, the chances of the other party surviving in the dangerous universe are not high. No one can live forever. Those 5 people are dead, and no computer can really exist forever, especially when the other party doesn't have a supply base like the Federation. These chips were made by Uncle," Sulu suddenly said in a low voice. "He's a genius in the human world. Perhaps only he can explain all of this, but you blew him to pieces." The old man said, "I think these chips are related to the Empire." Suli's body stiffened again. After a moment, he shook his head and said, "Everyone knows that the computers in the Empire are not even as good as your grandson. Anomalies 1 to 71 are deeply related to the Empire. The first time he entered an anomaly and escaped my surveillance was after he returned to the Federation from the Empire Star region." Sulu was not surprised to know that Uncle had been to the Empire. He lowered his head and looked at the somewhat white cloth on his knees. He said, "If these chips are really related to the Empire, does that mean that the Federation and the Empire might have originated from the same civilization before the catastrophe? This is not a very new or absurd inference. In fact, as early as the last 2 years of the 36 constitutional calendar, there were scholars from the Federation who came up with a similar idea. Although this idea was severely criticized, there are still many scholars publishing related papers to this day. What do you think? The people of the Empire are not the alien beetles in science fiction, nor are they some strange silicon-based life form that I can't even imagine. They have a physiological structure, social system, and civilization model that are extremely similar to the humans of the Federation. Even the slime with the lowest IQ can see the relationship between them and us. In the infinitely vast universe, the galaxy we live in is just a grain of sand. On this grain of sand, can life independently evolve into 2 completely identical civilizations? No, the universe produces miracles, not jokes. Well, it seems that the Federation and the Empire are really distant relatives. What a disgusting truth. Sulu thought gloomily. Not distant relatives, close relatives. The old thing said coldly and harshly. Sulu was silent for a long time before he shook his head and sighed. And I'm saying if the Federation and the Empire are really brothers who were separated from each other in the universe, then why is there only bloody war when we meet and nothing else? This question should be asked of a human, not a computer. In addition, according to the First Charter and the current laws of the Federation, even if the people of the Empire are the biological fathers of the people of the Federation, when they carry out unstoppable and life-threatening domestic violence against you, you can use a hammer to smash your biological father into a meat patty without bearing any legal responsibility. Sulu laughed and snapped his fingers to show his appreciation. Absolutely correct. Father and son were like this, let alone brothers who had not seen each other for many years. The Federal Central Computer ignored his resolute will and calmly issued its own request. Because the replacement chip behind your neck is related to the Empire, I suggest that you follow the Federation into the Empire's mainland and search for relevant clues. Su Li's answer was very simple. Okay, there's an antique building in the capital of the Empire. I don't have a map, but it should be easy to find because its owner is the great teacher of the empire. Chapter 507. Due to the chip on the back of the neck, it was difficult for the Federation and the Empire to send spies into each other's territory. However, in the past 100 years of history, the armies of both sides had attacked each other's territory before. In 1 year, the royal family of the Empire had even sent an official diplomatic mission. Both sides had a certain understanding of each other's social system and customs. In the past, Sulu did not care about the Empire because Eastwood was too far away from the front lines, and the miners' orphans were too far away from the war in the universe. However, now that he was a high-ranking officer of the Federation, he had to understand these things. However, when he heard the words great teacher, he was still confused. It seemed to be a very important official position in the Empire, but there were no more details in the materials he had read before. Sulu then noticed the hidden meaning in the old man's request. His expression became a little surprised and angry. You want me to go to the capital of the Empire to look for clues? Don't forget that I am a member of the Federation, not a god. This is no longer a matter of seeking death, but a ridiculous request. Unless the Federal Army has completely defeated the Empire by then and captured that crazy emperor. But in fact, I have always believed that the Federation will have a hard time defeating the Empire while I am still alive. Without waiting for the charter computer to answer, he waved his hand expressionlessly and said, "When the Empire invades the Empire next year, if I am still alive, I will help you look for clues. I am also very interested in this matter." These were Su Li's heartfelt words. Just before he took a shower, he had just received a secret dossier from the new 17th Division headquarters. The Ministry of Defense had confirmed that the newly formed new 17th Division would be quickly transferred to Planet 5460 after integration. This was the first battle that belonged to this unit. The Federation's victorious military operations had been progressing smoothly so far. This was especially so for the Iron 7th Division, who had achieved great success on Planet 5460. The Imperial Expeditionary Force led by old General Ambry was on the verge of collapse and could collapse in the glacier at any time. Naturally, the Federation had considered this aspect when choosing this planet as the new battlefield for the new 17th Division. However, a battlefield was a battlefield after all. People would always die on the battlefield, and no one could ever know who would be the next to die. Today, Sulu could control the MX and roar through the forest, rarely meeting a worthy opponent. Or he could hold the position of technical director in the army and live deep in the division, indifferently watching the fireworks. But he still did not have the confidence to be like the uncle in the underground sewer and shout arrogantly, "Of course I won't die. I'll never die." Thinking of the uncle, Sulu felt sad and longed for him. He had always thought that the omnipotent genius who could create thousands of clones like a computer would not die so easily. However, many years had passed, and his faint hope seemed to have gradually turned into a shadow. In low spirits, he said, "Can you not monitor me all the time in the future? Just like tonight, it suddenly entered my mind. This is somewhat hard to accept. I can only respond to the call of my friends. When I'm lonely, I can't take the initiative to seek your warmth. This is unfair." The old man used the white symbol to learn the emotion of hidden bitterness. I need to go to the toilet to poop. I need to use my phone. And sometimes I may be naked in bed with a beautiful girl to have sex. Sulu said angrily, "When I think of these, you are my body. It feels very wrong. In the past few years, you have only been naked in bed with a beautiful girl once, and that time, you did not complete your sex life." The charter computer replied calmly, "Of course, the biological defects of human beings should not be mocked by any person or machine. But in my opinion, sexual intercourse for the purpose of reproduction is meaningless if there's a layer of plastic between us, making it impossible to reproduce." Sulu lowered his head and hid between his knees. "If you want to obtain this kind of cerebral cortical pleasure, I can make you a neurostimulant with minimal side effects. I guarantee that the degree of pleasure will definitely surpass that of sex. What can I do to make you understand that sex is not just for pleasure? More importantly, I should have the right to privacy as stipulated in the first charter, right? I have always been very curious. If sex is not for pleasure, then what is it for? Could it be that humans can really create love when they change the name of this activity to love? Sulu replied angrily, "You don't know what love is. I know what love is." This is an excellent line from Schiller's unpublished work. I believe you can understand it. As for the right to privacy, when you accept the request to contact me, the first charter no longer protects your right to privacy. But according to the first charter, as a machine that serves humans, all information obtained from your cerebral cortex will be strictly confidential as the first sequence of information. No citizen can obtain any of your privacy through my channels. In a sense, your right to privacy is the same as your body. They're both safe. A universe that cannot be observed and whose existence has no effect on the universe we live in is a universe that does not exist for us. Is this the meaning of this concept of physics? Although your description is very inaccurate and does not conform to your academic standards, this is the meaning. Sulu suddenly asked, "Is Master Schiller really a member of the five-man team? Were those countless scripts really written by him?" 1. Yes. 2. In terms of the concept of the Federation's copyright law, yes. Sulu whistled softly and laughed happily. I suddenly remembered that you know all the details of the Federation's history. I can ask you again. If I continue to ask like this, I will definitely become the best historian in the Federation. This is certain, certain, and certain. This is also Schiller's line. The Federal Central Computer's reply had a hint of playfulness. I am very curious. If you always have some kind of human intelligence, then are you a man or a woman? Sulu asked seriously. Obviously, I am a machine without any human first or second sex characteristics, so I do not have a gender. Do you have a problem with my current image of a loyal housekeeper? Do you need me to act as a female secretary in stockings and high heels? Even though I believe that this kind of image is not suitable for my high level of calculation and logical analysis, based on my calculations, more than 30% of the 337 pornographic films you watched in the dark cells of Fox Castle Prison, which is what you call, had this kind of image for the female protagonist. Sulu opened his mouth wide. His neat teeth looked incomparably white and awkward in the night. After a while, like Commander Zhong in a restaurant, he said concisely and forcefully, "This topic ends here." The old thing's reply came immediately. It seemed to be a little excited. "Then, what are we talking about next? Your analysis of courtship? According to my calculations, Jian Shuier should be excluded from this list because..." "Good night." Sulu stood up, patted his butt, and waved goodbye with a smile at the dark night sky of the Westwoods. The Federal Central Computer was silent. Then, it left a final reply in his left eye. It was a string of extremely sad ellipses, standing alone outside the barracks. Behind him was a shadow of the tall wall and the black stone giant tree behind it. Sulu looked at the night sky and slowly raised his eyebrows, turning into a gentle smile. He believed that the old thing was not looking at him at this time. Although there was no way to confirm this, he had to believe. Otherwise, a life of being watched forever and being on edge forever would be meaningless. Just to live a happier life, he had to force himself to believe. This was probably the meaning of the spiritual victory method in Schiller's unpublished works. Gently stroking the ordinary metal bracelet on his left wrist, his calloused fingers slowly feeling the faint traces of the line of words. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He had not opened the bracelet for a long time, and he did not even think about it. However, this bracelet seemed to hide a secret of the universe, and that secret could be in the Empire. After a short period of reorganization, the new 17th Division, which carried the memories and glorious history of countless military bigwigs, boarded the battleship and headed for Planet 5460, the place where the Federation fired the first shot of the counterattack. Among the 3 fallen planets at the front line, Planet 5460 seemed to be in the best situation. The general attack of Planet 163, led by Deputy Commander E, was also proceeding smoothly. Only Planet 3320, where most of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's main forces were garrisoned, was unusually bloody. After an emergency discussion between the Joint Staff Conference and the enemy's headquarters, according to the Bureau of Proclamations calculations, President Pabre forcefully suppressed the tide of voices on Parliament Hill. As the military wished, they did not continue to send more troops to the front line to ensure the military reserves that would enter the empire the year after next. Instead, according to Zhang Shouhu's deployment, they directly transferred 14 mechanics from Planet 5460 and Planet 163 to Planet 3320. Under this background, Su Lu and the new 17th Division returned to Planet 5460, which was already close to a complete victory. Now, there were only a few troops left on this planet. The final task of clearing out the main force was carried out by two divisions. One was the Iron 7th Division, and the other was the new 17th Division. But just as Su Lu calmly explained that night, the battlefield was never a paradise where one could easily obtain the final victory. The remnants of the Imperial Expeditionary Force that were trapped in the frigid glacier, under the command of Ambly, this old but strong general, relied on their familiarity with the terrain of the northernmost hemisphere, the extreme weather, and their suicidal bravery to explode with astonishing combat power and forcibly drag these two Federation masters into the abyss of sporadic battles in the mountains. Reflecting the blue sky, the glacier glowed with a faint blue light, and the primeval forest at the foot of the mountain was mysterious and dark. In this harsh environment, there were soldiers of the Federation dying under the bullets of the Empire's field teams at every moment. Even those powerful MX mechas often fell into the traps set by the Empire's people, and then turned into charred remains under the intensive bombardment of the infantry's shoulder cannons that were like ants. Fell into the trap again? The Federation's most advanced mecha actually fell into the traps set by the ancient hunters. Is there something wrong with my brain? Or is the brain of the engineer who designed this thing frozen in the snow? In the snow-covered Federation camp, a bearded lieutenant colonel widened his eyes. He held the battle damage report in his hand and stared at the pilot in front of him. He waved his hand angrily and roared. If the mechanical leg stepped into the trap and can't be pulled out, how can this be called a fucking mecha? If it was the second robot who stepped in, I can still admit that you were trying to rape the Empire's son of a bitch hiding in the ice cave. Chapter 508. The Imperial Expeditionary Force on this planet was forced to retreat again and again under the ferocious attacks of the Federal Army. They were routed to the north, and at most, only 15% of their strength was left. They retreated back to the glaciers in the extreme north. Under such circumstances, it should have been extremely easy for the new 17th Division to carry out the final cleanup operation. However, reality gave them a heavy blow. Under the cold and tenacious command of that old fox, General Ambly, the remaining Imperial Expeditionary Force silently turned to guerrilla warfare. Tens of thousands of Imperial soldiers who knew that they had no way out and were in a desperate situation, not only did they not collapse from despair, they became even more ruthless and cruel, not only to the enemy, but also to themselves. They braved the dangers of the cold and appeared between the glaciers like night rats, looking for any opportunity to launch an attack on the Federation troops, completely disregarding their own lives. This kind of crazy, suicidal attack successfully dragged the new 17th Division, the Iron 7th Division, and the rest of the Federal forces into a bloody swamp. No, it should be said that they were in a cold hell. It was unknown whether it was before or after the start of the war, but the Imperial Expeditionary Force dug out countless deep pits covered by white snow in the glaciers that covered an area of about 3 million square kilometers. At the same time, they sent out countless melee explosive squads to guard the sides of the pits. The moment a Federation mecha fell into a deep pit, the Imperial soldiers who had long been waiting in ambush would rush forward and use their own blood-spurting bodies in exchange for the electromagnetic beam bombs on their shoulders to fire. No one knew how many soldiers of the Empire had silently frozen to death in the ice and snow in such a crazy way of fighting. But for the Federal forces, they only knew that these snow pits that had escaped their electronic surveillance buried countless Federation mecha and their brave pilot comrades, Lieutenant Colonel Healy, The regiment commander of the 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division tossed the battle damage report onto the snow with a gloomy expression and walked towards the regiment headquarters. His military boots left shallow footprints in the snow, beneath which was a layer of ice that had accumulated for who knew how many meters. It had already been 2.5 months since his troops had arrived at the combat zone, but they had not made much progress in clearing out the remnants of the Empire forces. Those Empire soldiers hiding in the glaciers were like beasts on the brink of death, coldly glaring at the Federation soldiers, ready to pounce out at any moment to beg for a life-and-death battle. Under this sort of suicidal fighting style, in just 10 days, 1st Regiment had lost another 6 M52 mecha and 2 MX mecha. What shocked and puzzled him was also the ability of the Imperial Expeditionary Force Command Center to control the remaining soldiers in the glaciers, as well as the ability of those Imperial colleagues to command. From the very beginning of the Federation's victorious military operation, they had successfully lured out the main armored forces of the Imperial Expeditionary Force in the north of the planet. They had also obtained the specific location of the underground fortifications that the Imperial people had been building for decades. In the subsequent attack, they had deployed large amounts of energy backups and long-range missiles to continuously bombard the area. In the end, the Federation Command Center had discovered that the old general named Ambry had actually left a backup plan. There were still several large underground bases hidden in the glaciers that the Federation had not been able to control. Report to the division headquarters. If the mecha mechanics can't come up with any good ideas, our division will refuse to enter the mountains again. Lieutenant Colonel Helay's eyes were sunken due to the tiredness of the past few days. There was a cold light in his eyes as he said, "Obeying orders is the duty of a soldier, but death is not death. From what I know, Hua Xiaoxi's mecha brigade has also temporarily stopped entering the mountains. The division headquarters currently has no plans to enter the mountains, but we shouldn't ask for it ourselves." An officer said worriedly, "The Imperial people have really gone crazy. This is a war that they are clearly going to lose. Why would they rather commit suicide than surrender? If they continue fighting like this, even if they can clean up the enemy completely, the losses of their troops will be extremely terrifying. Surrender? If it were me, I would also not be willing to be captured by the enemy after being away from home for so many years and being in such a hopeless situation. I would be more willing to trade my life for the enemy's. However, we are protecting the Federation. What are they doing this for?" Hilay said coldly. His mind flashed back to half a month ago when the first group entered the mountains to clean up the enemy. A Federation mecha had fallen into a deep pit in front of the snowy forest. It didn't even have time to break out of the ice before it was surrounded and attacked by hundreds of Imperial soldiers. Those Imperial soldiers actually didn't care about the first group's main forces behind the snowy forest at all. In the end, these hundreds of Imperial soldiers were all killed by the first group's powerful firepower. However, the Federation mecha that had fallen into the snow pit also exploded and died. Using the lives of 100 soldiers in exchange for one mecha was extremely correct in terms of battlefield value. However, even on the battlefield where human lives were as cheap as grass, Hilay and the federal military could not accept this kind of exchange method. He could not understand why those Imperial soldiers, whose single soldier uniforms were already tattered and could not keep them warm, whose faces were withered due to lack of nutrition, whose skin was festering due to the severe cold, and whose movements were somewhat unchanged, could suddenly become so swift in the final charge, their eyes shooting out a crazed gaze like that of a dying beast. What kind of ideology could make a group of invaders, a group of soldiers from the lower class of the Empire who had been bullied by the nobles, people without any moral support, completely ignore the terrifying threat of death and behave in such a fanatical and terrifying manner? Right at this moment, an engineer wrapped in cotton wool walked out from the side room of the regiment headquarters. His nose was red from the cold, and his spectacles flashed with the light of anger. He said loudly to Commander Hilay, "Mr. Lieutenant Colonel, I hope you can take back your previous verbal attack on the designer of the mecha. It was very obvious that Hilay's angry roar on the snowy ground had reached this engineer's ears. Hilay glanced at this person indifferently and did not pay him any attention. The engineer stomped his feet and said, "The MX mecha was designed by Lieutenant Colonel Sulu. If you want to scold him, it's best to do it to his face." Commander Hilay's expression stiffened slightly. He shrugged and walked past this person. He said, "Although he's my instructor, I still have to scold him when it's time to do so. Your mission is to immediately solve the problem of those damned ice pits' lethality towards the mecha. If this ridiculous situation of arrows piercing through alloy shields continues, I'm really worried that I and the Nutshell Engineering Department will become the biggest idiots in the universe war." The additional high-frequency shortwave positioning technology, which is also the crater braking technology you mentioned, has been basically successful after receiving Lieutenant Colonel Su Lee's data. After debugging, it will be installed on all the mecha immediately. Hilay suddenly stopped in his tracks and clenched his fists tightly. He said in a low voice, "Very good. On this planet, there must be countless officers and pilots cursing us. But I have to admit, back when we were doing the design in Hong Kong, we really made an extremely stupid mistake. There were problems with the data calculation of the balance instrument and the design of the joint transmission device. Once the MX's mechanical legs sank into the crater, the sensor would fail and feedback would be transmitted back to the assembly. The mecha system would not be able to instantly adapt to the posture. In other words, once you stepped on it, it would step down. Can you believe it? Our proudest work actually already had cerebellar dysplasia from the moment it was born. In the frigid world of ice and snow, a Federation troop of close to 100 people was silently advancing. Amidst the tracked, ice-breaking armored vehicles that had been specially developed for snow were 3 of the Federation's newest MX mecha. All 3 of the mecha were painted white, but for some reason, the waist and abdomen of these 3 white MX mecha seemed to be different from normal MX mecha. The white MX mecha at the back seemed to have been damaged and lost its power. It was barely able to move forward by the tractor. In the closed and insulated cockpit, a voice rang out. The words were filled with self-deprecating anger. "We are engineers. This kind of irresponsible self-blame and self-destructive impulse has no meaning. In my opinion, the MX design did not have too big of a problem. The main problem was caused by the special terrain of the 5460 glacial zone. Those M52s also sank into the ice crater and could not stand up on their own. This means that the senior engineers who designed the M-series also did not consider such an extreme environment. This includes your teacher, Professor Shin." A woman's voice rang out in the cockpit. The voice was calm and filled with the unique self-control of an engineer. Extreme environment? Fighter mecha should have been able to adapt to the extreme low temperatures on the vacuum mineral planet and the absolute high temperatures on the surface of the star. In the end, they were trapped in the ice crater. Do you think that makes sense? There are many kinds of extremes, especially on the battlefield. In the extreme north of this planet, the sea level increased too quickly. Whether it was the primeval forest at the periphery or the glacial zone that suddenly rose, they all severely limited the mecha's options. This way, the Empire was able to calculate and accurately set the location and depth of the crater. The most important thing was that everyone seemed to have underestimated the hardness of the ice, even though it was originally supposed to be gentle water. The woman in the cockpit continued calmly. At 0 degrees, the Fahrenheit hardness of ice is 1 to 2. At minus 15 degrees, the hardness is 2 to 3. At minus 40 degrees, the hardness is 4. At minus 50 degrees, the hardness is 6. In the glacial zone where the Empire is hiding, the air temperature is minus 30 degrees all year round. The surface temperature is even lower. According to the monitoring data over the past few days, the temperature inside the glacial zone has long since reached minus 60 degrees. The hardness of the ice at low temperatures surpasses that of Huagang rock and steel. Under such hardness, after the mecha's mechanical legs sink in, there is no way for them to break out of the ice by themselves. The Empire has the time to use heat to break the ice in advance, but the mecha on the battlefield do not have this kind of time. Also, don't you think that the design of the ice crater dug by the Empire is very exquisite? The ice craters we checked at the beginning of the month were all of the same caliber, and the depth was just right. Especially the forward sliding angle of the ice crater. The design was very beautiful. With the mech's mechanical leg sinking into the ice pit at such an angle, the hydraulic system connected to the spherical joint at the knee would immediately lose all function. Since there is no point of force and no space for displacement, the Empire's people had only used the most basic force calculation in classical physics to immobilize the most advanced MX mech. This proves that the classical laws of physics possessed the beauty of simplicity and cannot be resisted. In the cockpit, the female genius engineer from the Nutshell Engineering Department, Shang Xiao, looked at the data on the holographic screen in front of her and said calmly. She did not even look at Su Lu beside her. Chapter 509. Although I'm also an engineer, it's really hard to appreciate the simple beauty of classical physics. When I look at those mechas that were blasted into black charcoal and the Federation pilots that were steamed alive. The white MX mecha they were in had a very big problem with its power system. The cockpit life support system was limited to an extremely low level. The air was slightly cold, and the mecha that had been switched to forward mode was being dragged by the tractor in the snow and ice, shivering a little. Su Li's voice was also slightly trembling and cold at this time. In these past few years, he had maintained a high level of contact with Shang Xiao. Although the emails were basically just boring design communication, the two of them had already become extremely close and familiar with each other through these back-and-forth symbols, formulas, and blueprints. He knew that Shang Xiao was a freak genius who was crazy about engineering, but as a soldier of the Federation, hearing these steady and emotionless words, hearing praise for the ice pits dug by the Empire people, was still a little hard to accept. Shang Xiao did not notice the change in his emotions and continued speaking calmly. But your countermeasures are also very strong. After installing that system, even if it still can't solve the problem of the mecha stepping on the pits for now, at least you can make predictions in advance. As long as you can accurately determine the pits under the snow and ice, the Federation mecha won't be stupid enough to step into them themselves. Her gaze moved away from the screen, and she used the tip of her finger to push up her glasses on the bridge of her nose. She looked seriously at Su Lu and said, "That system is very simple, but it can solve a big problem. Your design concept is also very simple and beautiful. I've always wanted to pry open your head and see what's hidden inside." Su Lu replied in his heart, "There are countless hard stones and misfits hidden under the skull. Together with the massive amount of conceptual blueprints stored in the Federation's central computer and perhaps many pornographic movies, there are many. Normal military mechanics engineers would find it very difficult to think of using such simple civilian technology because we are very unfamiliar with it. How do you think of doing this? My education in mechanical engineering since I was young is that no matter how sophisticated and complicated a machine is, it can be treated as the simplest household appliance, such as a hairdryer." Su Lu thought of the operation room beside the mine. He narrowed his eyes and said, "That echo positioning system uses high-frequency sound wave logging technology. It's often used when mining in Donglin. You know that I was originally from Donglin. Donglin. Well, it seems that engineers really need to broaden their horizons. They can't always hide in the underground engineering department like me." Shang Xiao nodded. She picked up the electrosensitive pen and scratched the itchy spot between her eyebrows. She said, "Since the problems on the battlefield have basically been resolved, you should put all your energy into the mecha testing side. Regarding the MXT's trial run status, you should have given more suggestions. Right now, I am the technical director of the 17th Division, not the technical director of Nutshell." Su Lu replied somewhat angrily, "And don't forget, as your test subject, I am already injured at this time. When I bleed too much, it will suppress the secretion of the flow, Hillu's glands, causing a spatial cognitive barrier. Under these circumstances, my suggestions can only make this broken mecha explode even more spectacularly." Chung Fengsher was introduced to the Nutshell Engineering Department by you. After his turbocharger technology was modified. He also received your confirmation in the mail. But it is still a first-generation prototype after all. The twin engines and turbochargers are not well coordinated. Isn't it very normal for problems to occur? Sulu thought of the explosion that had occurred 3 days ago in the middle of the glacier. Thinking of the splashes of alloy fragments and the black smoke that had filled the pure white sky, he could not help but feel his heart palpitate. If the protective measures had not been taken well, he might not have died on the battlefield against the Empire, but in the Federation's new mecha testing. But I heard that the MXD sent to 3320 by the Nutshell Engineering Department did not explode. I don't think that Madman Lee's understanding of mecha is better than mine. Maybe his character is better than yours, Shang Xiu replied calmly. A trace of unwillingness flashed across her face that was still pretty and delicate without makeup. She said faintly, from the feedback of the current data, both tests have actually failed. Su Li's brows furrowed slightly, and he looked at her in confusion. Shang Xiu raised her head and said seriously, "The power of the mecha is not unstable. It can be solved through adjustment, but when the MXD breaks through the MX's instantaneous overclocking state, other than you and Lieutenant Colonel Ifong, no one else would be able to bear this kind of load. Even if someone could bear it, there would be no way for them to have such fast reflexes. The purpose of my mecha design is not to create 2 super warriors like you two, but to raise the military standards of the entire Federation." Super warrior, this name sounds rather old-fashioned, but it's also pretty cool, said Su Lu with a smile. The Federal troops moved very slowly in the world of ice and snow. The team formed by the Caterpillar Heavy Armored Icebreaker Vehicle, the Tractor Vehicle, and the 3 white mechas braved the violent wind and snow as they carefully moved forward in the narrow space. Lan Xiaolong sat in the first armored vehicle, his expression dark and unpleasant. His gaze was fixed on the holographic screen. His left shoulder was wrapped in a first aid bandage, and the smell of healing glue continuously wafted out from it. In front of him, Gu Shifeng's gaze was fixed on the electronic monitoring holographic screen, clearly more alert than Lan Xiaolong's. Meanwhile, Bai Yulan was holding onto the battlefield command system, methodically sending out orders to the entire team. The originally pristine and solemn world of ice and snow appeared ferocious because of the roaring snowstorm. To the Federal forces, the more dangerous was the Imperial Expeditionary Force, who was hiding somewhere. On the way back, they had already encountered a few small-scale pursuers. 1 military vehicle had been blown up, and 4 soldiers of the 17th Division had died. The Federation's rebuilt charter network would always have gaps, especially in the Arctic glacial regions. The surviving Imperial Expeditionary Force were destroying the Federation's surveillance equipment at all costs. The satellites in the sky were obscured by the thick snow clouds, and the Federation's reconnaissance aircraft did not dare to enter the complex snowy mountains under such weather conditions, so they could only rely on themselves. This team belonged to the new 17th Division and was directly led by the technical director of the new 17th Division, Su Lu. Their mission this time was not to fix the holes in the charter network, but to test the Federation's newest model, the MXD Mecha, through a routine reconnaissance mission. Although this new model of mecha was only slightly modified from the MXD Mecha, the Federal military had high hopes for it, because the power system had been synthesized with micro-turbocharger technology. However, no one had expected that one of the 3 mecha tested this time would be damaged. The Federation had strictly prohibited abandonment or self-destruction, so the team had no choice but to painstakingly carry them back. During the arduous journey back, they encountered a sneak attack from a small unit of the Empire. However, what was even more frightening was that since last night, they had encountered a geomagnetic outburst rarely seen on planet 5460. Due to the geomagnetic outburst, it was extremely difficult for them to contact division headquarters. They were unable to instantly connect to the charter network, so they were unable to carry out an accurate real-time positioning. Add to that the raging snowstorm, and the entire team was actually lost. 3 p.m. in the afternoon, regional standard time. The sky was already beginning to darken, and the fake sun had long since sunk, causing this 17th Division team to stop in their tracks. Wearing individual winter suits, the soldiers jumped down from the armored vehicles and began to prepare the temporary camp. In this sort of terrible weather, in this sort of terrible place, if the temperature insulation measures for the temporary camp could not be done properly, after one night, no one would wake up the next day. Sulu climbed down from the cockpit of the mecha and then stretched out both hands toward the ceiling. And then, everyone saw a scene that shocked them to their core. Shang Qiu walked out of the cockpit, and without even thinking or hesitating, her legs kicked off, and her body remained in a sitting position as she jumped down. The height of the cockpit of the MX mecha in its moving state was still enough to kill a cow, but she had jumped down just like that. After a short moment, with a soft pop, Sulu caught her. The female engineer in Su Li's arms had a calm expression on her face, without any trace of excitement or fear. This was because the engineer's thinking and precise calculations, as well as the tacit understanding between work partners, told her that jumping down from such a high place, Sulu would definitely be able to catch her. My waist still hurts a little. Shang Qiu used her heavily gloved hand to push against her waist, her brow furrowed as she said, "Next time, you need to increase the buffer distance by half." "I need to kneel down," Sulu replied. "That way, you can ensure the buffer distance. But the question is, why do you insist on jumping down?" "I don't like the MX mecha ladder you designed. Firstly, it's not aesthetically pleasing. Secondly, the gap is too wide, and the posture of the girl when she steps down is very ugly. Also, the psychological consultant from the HR department, in nutshell, has recommended that I participate in more outdoor training," replied Shang Qiu matter-of-factly. "Firstly, mecha are used to kill people, not for beauty pageants. Secondly, the Federation currently does not have a single female pilot. Also, this type of training can only train my arm muscles. As for your psychological aspect of overcoming fear, I never thought that the concept of fear existed in your brain. Then you can interpret it as me wanting you to hug me." Shang Qiu's eyes suddenly blinked. Su Li's face was somewhat hot, and then, at this moment, he suddenly felt the ground beneath his feet disappear. Bai Yulan and a few other officers were just about to come over for a routine report. They clearly heard this tedious conversation and could not help but shrug innocently like Lan Xiaolong. In their view, Sulu, who could sit in front of a workbench for more than 30 hours without eating or drinking while looking at countless symbols, formulas, and blueprints, was already a freak in some ways. But compared to Shang Qiu, this genius engineer from Nutshell, he was more normal. Right at this moment, they suddenly saw the male and female engineer who were hugging each other suddenly sink into the snow, disappearing in the blink of an eye into the snowstorm. I have long since become numb to it, but I'm still not happy. After coming back to my senses, I will work hard. That's all I have to say. I don't need to explain anything else. You all know me. Chapter 510. The ice and snow around them slid down, showering the two people in the face. It was a little painful, and the speed of their descent increased. It was a little hair-raising. Fortunately, they did not slide for too long. Both of their feet landed on the ground with a muffled thud. This snow cave was not too deep. Su Li's legs were still numb. He knelt down, but his arms were still tightly wrapped around Shang Qiu. The two of them were extremely calm, especially Shang Qiu. She had not screamed the entire way down, but her arms around Su Li's neck were exceptionally tight. Su Li's brows furrowed slightly. He straightened his body with some difficulty and put Shang Qiu down. He looked around warily at the dark surroundings. Not sensing any danger, he took out the light stick from his arm pocket and snapped it with a snap. A faint light instantly illuminated the surroundings of the cave. From the quick solidifying cement wall beside them, they could quickly determine that this was a man-made space. This space was so large that the light from the military light stick could not illuminate the end of it. The two of them could faintly see countless densely packed gray cloth bags on the ground in the distance. They guessed that they were probably some stored supplies. Sulu immediately glanced at his wristwatch. After confirming that the signal connection with the ground had not been interrupted due to the underground space and the geomagnetic storm, only then did he relax. He lowered his voice and said to the system, "It's safe. Don't worry. The distance underground is about 6 meters." Shang Qiu brushed away the ice and snow on her body and asked, "You clearly installed the echo positioning device on the MXD first. Why didn't the mecha alarm us? If it's because the mecha we're in is seriously damaged, then the other 2 MXDs didn't alarm us either." This was originally the exploration well system used by the Donglin mine tunnel, but I changed it a little. Now, this system will only alarm the man-made space. This underground space is built on the top of a natural ice rock, so the MXDs naturally won't alarm us. Sulu picked up the light stick and glanced at the dry and cold rock surface above. He frowned and said, "The rock wall should be very thin. Because of the long years of cold, a weak line has been torn open in the ice layer above. That's why we fell down." "Why did you make such changes?" "We don't know how many natural cavities there are beneath the glacier area. If the Federation mecha were to report even the natural cavities, then we wouldn't even have to wait for the Empire to attack us. We wouldn't even be able to take a single step forward ourselves." Sulu explained as he listened attentively to the sounds coming from above. By Magnolia should be preparing the zip line at this time. Other than the dry and cold air in this underground space, there was no danger, so he was not in a hurry. He picked up the light stick and shone into the distance. Suddenly, he frowned. He felt that those gray things looked a little strange. For the sake of safety, the two of them did not move. They extended the light closer and found that under the wall, not far from their right, there were also many gray things piled up messily together. Suddenly, 2 faint reflections appeared between the gray things. Sulu squinted his eyes and looked carefully. He finally recognized that it should be a pair of eyes. It was a pair of eyes that had been frozen by the cold. They were filled with the shock and sorrow of death. Around the eyes, after careful examination, they could see that it was a very small face. The skin on the face was completely covered by dust. Only those brittle strands of hair outlined the outline of the face. Su Li's eyes suddenly widened. He looked around from the little girl's body and finally saw that these gray things that were piled up like garbage were not supplies, but countless corpses piled up together. In a dark underground cave, suddenly seeing so many corpses, Shang Qiu, who had been able to maintain her calm when she fell into the deep cave, suddenly paled. Sulu knew that she was frightened. He quickly pulled her into his arms and buried her face in his chest. He did not want her to see this horrible scene again. Shang Qiu's body was trembling slightly. Sulu gently patted her twice. That pair of small eyes were extremely round. His gaze was as cold as the temperature of this place. It was indescribably cold as it slid over the gray corpses. Bai Yulan slid down the zipline. Naturally, she followed Su Li's gaze and was also stunned by this scene. They were all iron-blooded men who had experienced life and death on the battlefield. They had seen all kinds of miserable deaths, but this was the first time they saw so many corpses piled up together without dignity. The light shone from near to far, but everywhere it shone was gray. It was impossible to count how many people were buried in this spacious underground space. Probably because they did not hear any response, a few more people slid down the ground. While they were shocked, they quickly followed Su Li's instructions and brought the trembling Shang Qiu up. With a whoosh, the high-brightness lamp was inserted into the wall. The light in the underground space suddenly brightened, and they could see more clearly. Everyone couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air, and their expressions became shocked and perplexed. Sulu squatted down and began to examine the frozen corpses. Just about 10 meters in front of him, there were at least 100 corpses piled up. There were old people, children with frightened eyes, half-naked women, and young men with wounds on their bodies. All of these corpses were covered in a thick layer of gray. Bai Yulan picked up a smear of ash from a woman's corpse that was piled at the top of the pile. She gently rubbed it twice and said to him, "This is the Empire's weasel hair latex explosive. After being frozen for a long time, it decomposed into gray powder. It seems that in the beginning, they were preparing to burn all of these corpses to ashes. But for some reason, they did not complete it in the end." Sulu nodded and silently turned the little girl whose eyes were still open after she died. Because of the cold, for many years, all of the corpses were almost stuck together. This action was somewhat difficult to do, especially when the sound of flesh tearing made him and the soldiers behind him tremble uncontrollably. "It's one of us." Sulu stared at the bloody hole behind the little girl's neck where the chip was and said with a voice without a trace of emotion, "You guys check the other corpses." As expected, the corpses piled up here all had a bloody hole behind their necks that had been frozen by ice, revealing the white cervical vertebrae. There were traces of brutal destruction on the joints, and the chips in the vertebrae had disappeared without a trace. After the tragic First War, the people of the Empire were most afraid of and hated the Federation's the glory of the Charter. They wanted to decipher the secrets of the Federation's charter at all times. The chips behind the necks of the Federation captives were naturally their most important spoils of war. Although after a long period of experiments, the Empire confirmed that there was no way to obtain the technology they needed from these chips, but this bloody and cruel method became a habit of the Imperial armies. "It seems that everyone here is our people." Sulu stood up and looked at the endless gray in the darkness. Thinking of how many of his compatriots had died here, his heart was unprecedentedly heavy and gloomy. "I found an exception." Lan Xiaolong waved his light stick not far away and pointed at a corpse in front of him with a complicated expression. "This guy is from the Empire because he's wearing the Empire's military uniform. Also, his neck is undamaged." Everyone walked over and stared at the corpse of the Empire's military officer in confusion, not knowing why he would appear here. Bai Yulan lowered her head slightly and said, "The wolf howl latex took a long time to decompose. The military uniform of this Empire's military officer is old-fashioned. It seems that this massacre happened many years ago. Because of the dry and cold environment of this place, the corpses are well preserved." Sulu didn't say anything. He just stared at the corpse of the Empire's military officer in silence, the fingers of his right hand trembling slightly. Lan Xiaolong stood up and handed over a small booklet. "What is this?" "It should be the diary of this military officer. His rank should be quite high to be able to use this kind of fiber paper. Be careful when you flip through it. It may break at any time." There was nothing shocking in this diary. About 90% of the first half was describing the feelings of this military officer named Arthur when he was far away from his homeland of the Empire. The 7 years of boring interstellar travel were filled with a sense of boredom. The later half talked about his battle life on planet 5460 and his yearning for the maple trees of his hometown. It wasn't until the last page that it described the night before the massacre, his mental activity. An Empire military officer who didn't want to slaughter Federation civilians was killed by his own army. Sulu closed the diary and looked at the corpse at his feet. He was silent for a long time. "It's not strange for there to be an extra person among the animals, but this doesn't change the definition of them as animals." Bai Yulan's eyes were cold as she replied. "Although it's not easy to pinpoint the location now, we still need to record this location." Sulu looked at Gu Shifeng and said, "Because this place will be built as a memorial in the future." "Understood," Gu Shifeng replied with a serious tone. Ever since the victorious military operation, the Federal Army had launched a major counterattack on the 3 fallen planets. However, the troops had basically never found any living citizens of the Federation in the enemy-occupied areas. After a lot of effort, they had only found a few wild tombs and occasionally a few corpses. Group 7 had found some corpses on planets 5460 and 163, but the number of graves and corpses didn't match the population statistics before the Imperial Expeditionary Force took over. The upper echelons of the Federation government and military already had some very bad guesses a long time ago. They were worried that the civilians had already died in the secret massacre of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. Today, the new 17th Division's accidental discovery proved this tragic reality. Sulu looked at the countless corpses covered in dust in front of him. His eyes narrowed slightly. After a moment of silence, he took off his military hat. The soldiers behind him also took off their military hats or helmets. Everyone lined up and solemnly saluted and said goodbye to these comrades who had been dead for many years. Chapter 511. The standard time was 4:30 p.m., and the sky was already pitch black. Night always came earlier in the northernmost part of planet 5460 than in other places. The howling snowstorm was like countless willow catkins dancing wildly in the air. In addition to the thick clouds above blocking out the stars, there was not a single ray of light to be found around the endless stretch of glacier, only darkness. There were no roads in the glacier to begin with, only a narrow piece of flat ground crushed out of the ground. The three white MXD mechas of the new 17th Division in charge of testing stood silently on this flat ground like silent giants. Under their feet were the armored vehicles and tractors that carried supplies and instruments. The industrial achievements of human beings were instantly covered by the wind and snow that filled the sky, as if they were covered by a very thick blanket of snow. The clear structural lines and metallic brilliance could no longer be seen. They had been integrated with the environment and turned into an ice cliff that had been there for 10,000 years. It was impossible to distinguish them at all. The Federation soldiers' camp was right between the bodies of the 10,000-year-old ice, cliff-like mechas. Who knew how many Empire soldiers were hidden in this glacier and snowy mountain they had lost their way into? So the camp maintained long-range radio silence. There was silence, only silence. The lights were also under control, so it was pitch black. The giant mechas and armored vehicles around the camp were densely packed, blocking out the fierce snowstorm outside. The specially made simple shelter was unable to completely block out the extremely low temperature here. After a simple meal, everyone crawled into their sleeping bags and stared at the ceiling with their eyes open. Only after enduring until perhaps deep in the night did they finally fall into a deep sleep. Suli's eyes were open the entire time. His gaze shot out from those small eyes of his, piercing through the pitch-black surroundings, through the rustling ceiling, as if he wanted to look past the thick snow clouds 1,000 meters above his head and see the brilliant starry sky. He could not sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, the greenish-gray face of the little girl's corpse in the underground space would appear before his eyes, especially those eyes that were frozen but still glowing with a dim light. He had already killed when he was 12 years old, and, counting until today, at least 100 lives had died by his hands. In a sense, he could be said to have killed people like flies. As for human corpses, he was almost numb to seeing them on the front lines. It was difficult for him to feel the initial nervousness and fear that made him want to vomit, but today, for some reason, his emotions were somewhat different. It was probably because the little girl underground was about the same age as a small watermelon when she died. Sula narrowed his eyes. If little Watermelon died so tragically, how sad and desperate would he be? Where's the little girl's family? Perhaps he had also died in this massacre, or perhaps he was right beside her. If that was the case, wouldn't the little girl's departure be more peaceful? Was the massacre of civilians really a necessary evil in a racial war? This magnificent war was naturally an incomparably great project, but as an inconspicuous individual, what could he do? What could he do for these people who shouldn't have died, and what shouldn't have happened? The Imperial Expeditionary Force had not completely occupied the planet, but so many citizens of the Federation had already been massacred. How many civilians had died on the other two fallen planets? Sulu felt that his throat was a little dry and painful. He thought of some of the things that Commander Zhong had talked about in the restaurant, the things that made the citizens and civilians of the West would feel sad and indignant. If the Federation had not always given up or even deliberately forgotten these 2.5 planets, if the Department of Defense had not followed the instructions left by military godly Pifu to carry out the rotational warfare in the West Woods in the past few years, and instead of training for the invasion of the Empire, and instead launched a counterattack in advance, would it be possible to save some of their massacred compatriots, such as the lives underground not far away? What are you thinking about? Shang Qiu's voice came from beside him. Shang Qiu was the only woman in the troop responsible for the test reconnaissance mission. She naturally arranged her sleeping bag beside, Su Lu. It seemed that all the women had full trust in Su Li's moral character. Su Lu lowered his voice and replied, I'm thinking about this thing called war. I realize that this thing is a monster. It's hard to understand. The Federation soldiers around them had long fallen asleep. It was pitch black all around them. There was a clear whistling sound outside the camp, announcing the probing invasion of the cold snowstorm. Shang Qiu exhaled and replied softly, I heard that the history of mankind before the catastrophe was a history of war. The Federation meeting the Empire is just a repetition of ancient history. The Federation, those tens of thousands of years without war, were so happy, Su Lu replied with a smile. Probably because she was stimulated by the corpses of the civilians of the Federation during the day. Shang Qiu was silent for a few seconds before suddenly asking, If the war is over, what do you plan to do? She was worried that she would wake up the soldiers in the camp, and because the air was a little cold, her voice was a little trembling. If that day comes, I really want to go back to the nutshell engineering department and be a normal engineer. At this time, Su Li's mind was still replaying Commander Zhong's words. He said self-deprecatingly, but I don't think I'll live to see that day. In the darkness, Shang Qiu's eyes glittered. Her lips had just curled up when she was suppressed by the second half of the sentence. After another long silence, Shang Qiu squeezed into Su Li's sleeping bag in silence. It's cold. Squeeze together to get warm. Su Lu was stunned for a moment. He moved his body and helped her squeeze in. Then, he zipped up the sleeping bag again. His left arm naturally wrapped around her waist and hugged her. He found that although she was wearing a full set of clothes-fitting clothes, her body temperature was indeed a little cold and not hot. We're not going to die here, are we? Shang Qiu held his chin and leaned into his arms tightly. She seemed a little helpless. We won't. Su Lu gave his promise very seriously. He hugged her tightly, lowered his head, and sniffed. He found that although this genius female engineer hadn't washed her hair for a few days, her hair didn't smell bad. Shang Qiu's lips finally curled up. It seemed that she was relieved because of Su Li's words. She twisted her body comfortably and found a suitable angle. She slightly raised her face and gently kissed Su Li's slightly dry lips. Su Lu slightly pursed his lips and found that her lips were as soft as her body. They were very moist, cold, and sweet like the ice persimmons sold in Wangdu Market. Their lips gently pressed together without any unnecessary movements. He didn't know whether it was because the weather was too cold or because death was too clear, but he didn't have any desire. Shang Qiu lifted the hem of her sweater and gently held Su Li's hand, letting him reach in. Feeling that sliver of warmth and the thick calluses on his palm, she couldn't help but let out a soft hum. Shang Qiu placed her hand outside the sweater and inside the sweater. Her voice was calm as she said, You know, I've never treated those men in the engineering department as men, so it's also very hard for me to treat myself as a woman. Su Lu looked in her bright eyes and replied in a nasal voice. After the MX Mecha standard was confirmed in the nightclub beside Capital University, I once asked you if you were a virgin. Shang Qiu's bright eyes were wide open. Probably because it was too dark, she couldn't see the person in front of her clearly, so she didn't like to squint her eyes like she usually did when she wasn't wearing glasses. Su Li's eyesight was much better than the average person's. Looking at this pair of bright and calm eyes, he was somewhat puzzled as to why she could be so calm. Just as he was about to answer, he heard her continue with a slight smile. Actually, I'm a virgin. Don't you think this kind of thing is very boring? I mean, compared to solving those engineering problems. Shang Qiu's face was slightly red, but her voice was still as calm as ever. Those are two different kinds of pleasure. Su Lu thought for a while before replying. Then, after another period of silence, he looked at her face and said seriously, Let's fall in love. Perhaps you'll find out. This kind of thing really is a bit interesting. A faint, warm feeling of lust rose up in the crowded sleeping bag. The young man and woman's bodies hugged each other, rubbing against each other. However, because of the two people's usual calm thinking, they were unable to break through a certain boundary. What about Minister Zhou's daughter? Shang Qiu looked into his eyes and asked, Please keep it a secret. I don't have a romantic relationship with her, replied Su Lu. But this is a rather complicated story. Then you don't want a nation's maiden either? Gossip, definitely gossip. I admit that I was indeed quite happy and close to her when I was with her, but we definitely didn't talk about feelings. Zhang Xiaoming, in the past. The woman in the apartment in Sunset State. Would you believe me if I said that she and I were just old friends from back in the day? I don't believe you. Shang Xiu opened her bright eyes and said, "Don't forget that I'm also an excellent engineer. My eyes are very sharp. I know that you like a lot of people, but I just happened to appear in front of you at this time. Everything in the world is originally made up of countless coincidences. As an excellent engineer, you should understand this point." Chapter 512. When Su Lu woke up, it was already early in the morning, but there wasn't much light around the camp. He shifted his body and realized that his left hand had unknowingly reached in a Shang Xiu's sweater, greedily holding onto that ridiculously beautiful thing. He didn't know if it was because it was too hot in the sleeping bag or for some other reason, but his body was drenched in sweat and his underwear stuck together, making him feel a little uncomfortable. He slowly pulled his hand out and quietly looked at the sleeping Shang Xiu beside him. She wasn't wearing glasses, and her eyes were tightly shut. He was surprised to find another side of her that was different from her usual calm, intelligent, careless, and boyish self. The girl's cheeks were slightly puffed up in her sleep, as if she had 2 steamed buns in her mouth. She smacked her lips from time to time, looking very cute. Reluctantly, he climbed out of the sleeping bag, adjusted his winter clothes, and walked out of the camp. He kicked away the snow and crouched under the mecha. Squinting his eyes at the first ray of light that was beginning to reflect from the other end of the glacier, he began to rinse his mouth. He sprayed a fast-acting comprehensive detergent into his mouth, and an intense numbness and itchiness came from his gums. This very unpleasant experience made him close his eyes tightly, his brows furrowed together. This was like the expression of a philosopher when he was thinking hard about a problem, or the expression of a pure little boy desperately recalling his youth. Su Lu closed his eyes to comfort himself. "You look like you're constipated." Shang Xiu, who had just put on her clothes, walked over with her shoulders shrunk, puffing out steam, and crouched beside him. Su Lu didn't answer her. Only when the numbness in his mouth gradually faded did he open his eyes. He dug up a lump of snow from the surface of the mecha beside him and stuffed it into his mouth. After chewing hard for a while, he spat it out. Perhaps it really was because the 2 of them were too cramped in the sleeping bag, but the 2 of them were the first to wake up. Shang Xiu took the detergent he handed over and began the same rinsing procedure. The girl's straight eyebrows curved into 3 crescents from the stimulation, like a female middle school student drinking white wine for the first time. She couldn't help but open her mouth, sucking in the incomparably cold air. "Be careful not to freeze your lungs," reminded Su Lu. "Wouldn't matter." Shang Xiu opened her mouth as if she was being examined by a doctor. She looked at the glacier peak in the distance and said vaguely, "Look, Bien is so beautiful." Women like to be beautiful, so her pronunciation of the word beautiful was still so accurate at this time. Su Lu smiled and stood up. He followed Shang Xiu's gaze and saw a rare beauty. The tallest glacier in the west was radiating a magnificent white-gold light under the morning sun. Behind it was a mirror-like blue sky. It was clear and beautiful, like a dream, like the heaven of the afterlife in imagination. In front of such a beautiful scene, the smile on Su Li's lips quickly disappeared, and he angrily cursed in his heart. It seemed that the snowstorm had stopped last night, and the thick clouds had moved away from the blue sky in the west. Even if the geomagnetic storm was still going on, the possibility of contacting the charter network was much higher. What were Gu Shifeng and her subordinates in charge of surveillance doing? "Good morning," Su Lu said quickly. Shang Xiu, who was squatting on the ground with a frown, did not know that he was talking to the air or something else. After a moment of shock, she replied inexplicably, "Oh." A line of white characters quickly appeared in Su Li's left eye. "Thank you for your call." "Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. It seems that you had a good time last night." A man and a woman woke up at the same time in the morning and took care of their personal hygiene together. This should be what couples do after sex. Although this is a battlefield with special conditions, I still want to congratulate you. It was rare that Sue Lu did not stop the Federal Central Computer's boring speculation and seemingly calm mechanical, but actually absurd and long-winded analysis statement. A hint of a happy smile appeared on his face. He immediately undid the cuff on his sleeve and pulled up the electronic military map from his wristwatch. He immediately began the long-distance positioning. 3 seconds later, with the help of the Federal Central Computer, he determined the location of his troops. He was somewhat relieved to find that they did not get lost and enter the most dangerous area. If they had moved 30 kilometers to the west during the snowstorm yesterday, right now, they would most likely have been surrounded by the Imperial Expeditionary Force. He turned his head and shouted a few words to the people in the camp, and he sent the electronic map into Gu Shifeng's hands. Then, he quickly walked to the side of the hole he had discovered yesterday. He kicked away the floating snow on the surface, grabbed the zip line, and prepared to jump down. "What are you doing?" Shang Qiu used her sleeve to wipe the snow from the corner of her mouth and asked in surprise. "I am communicating with the Almighty Creator." Su Lu smiled and then jumped down the zip line into the hole. Shang Qiu looked at this scene in a daze. She thought to herself, "You are a genius engineer, not a superstitious Bermudian. How could you believe that there is a creator in the universe? Also, in all religions, the creator should be in the sky. Why did you jump into the ground?" The number of Federation civilians who died in the massacre of the Empire and were buried in ice in the underground space was about 9,000 to 11,000 people. This was the answer given by the Federal Central Computer after Su Li's eyes quickly scanned it. Because all the corpses were frozen in one place, even with the Federal Central Computer's graphic calculation ability, it was unable to give a more accurate number. Su Li's chest felt heavy from this heavy number. He silently climbed back to the surface and walked into the camp. Looking at his team members who were busy, he patted his chest, trying to suppress his emotions. Only then did he realize that his hand had patted something hard. Only then did he remember that the diary written by the Empire officer, Arthur, had been in his pocket all this time. The snowstorm had stopped, but the cold had returned at some unknown time. The geomagnetic storm had temporarily weakened, but no one knew when it would become violent again. Therefore, the people in the camp carried out their work with incomparable speed. They had already contacted the headquarters of the new 17th Division and had a clearer understanding of the surrounding environment and the situation of both sides. The area controlled by the Empire is in this direction. Bai Yulan pointed to the northeast on the screen and said, "The base is here. The Iron 7th Division has a regiment here. Yesterday, we were very lucky and walked out of the Empire's conventional ambush area. Gu Shifeng has already taken care of the relevant coordinates and the realistic route map. There is no danger for us to return to the base now. It will be a safe journey." Su Lu nodded. Thinking about the recent snowstorm, he felt very satisfied. Suddenly, he thought of something and asked, "What about the rest of the troops?" Before the geomagnetic storm, most of the troops retreated. However, there may be troops trapped in the east. That area is still in a high-intensity snowstorm area. The clouds are too thick, and the geomagnetic storm density shows no signs of weakening. The charter network is unable to detect it, Bai Yulan replied. However, the Federal Forces' supplies and protection from the cold should be no problem. No matter how crazy and desperate the Empire is, they will not start a battle in this damned weather. Therefore, their safety should be guaranteed. However, at this moment, an emergency call for help in the Federation language sounded from the full-band monitoring device in the camp. Hoarse gasps for breath, accompanied by clear and concentrated gunshots. Including Su Lu, everyone's body trembled slightly. They quickly walked over and heard the emergency call for support from a certain troop clearly sound from the monitoring device. This signal was somewhat weak and intermittent, but it was enough to prove that something had happened somewhere. "Air support. We lost our position. The Empire's people have gone crazy. They are a brigade. Command system damaged. Needs to be repaired." There was a second of silence in the camp. Gu Shifeng lowered her head and quickly checked the electronic records. She reported, "It's a filtered B-section channel. A Federal Forces unit was being crazily attacked by an entire Imperial brigade." Everyone's expression was rather solemn. No one would have thought that at this point in the war, the Imperial Expeditionary Army, which was barely surviving, would actually have the courage to gather a large group of soldiers and launch a crazy counterattack despite the terrible weather. In the current state of the war, with the battlefield command system damaged, it could basically be said that this unit was infinitely close to defeat. It could be imagined how tense the situation over there was. However, Su Lu thought of something else. Even in the dual situation of a geomagnetic storm and a snowstorm, the Federal Forces would very likely use this hard-to-hide, filtered communication mode. Unless the command system of this unit was damaged and all long-distance communication methods were cut off. However, the Federal Forces were like the new 17th Division or the Iron 7th Division. On the wrist of every soldier, there was a chip that connected to the charter network, except for one unit. Gu Shifeng also thought of this. She raised her head and said hesitantly, "It should be the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Forces." "No, it's the Federation Special Forces 1st Division." Su Lu gave a simple order. "Contact the division headquarters and report the situation of the Eastern Unit being ambushed. Ask for quick backup. Air support won't be able to get in." Bai Yulan shook her head and said, "Repairing the command system is not easy. Even if they have their own repair engineers, where are they going to find the parts?" Su Lu stared at the electronic map in front of him. His gaze gradually moved to the shadowy area covered by thick clouds. He saw the eye-catching symbol at the edge of the area. After a moment of silence, he said, "Contact the Iron 7th Division immediately. Their position is the best, and they definitely have backup parts. Ask them to go and help." "Yes, boss. I am the technical director of the new 17th Division, Lieutenant Colonel Su. I am the commander of the 1st Regiment of the Iron 7th Division, Lieutenant Colonel Dongfang Pei. Our division has received your request. We reject your request." A cold and disciplined voice clearly sounded in the camp. The commander of the Iron 7th Division, Dongfang Pei, didn't seem to think at all. He didn't seem to show any sympathy. He simply and directly rejected the request to go and help. Su Lu looked at the communication device in silence. He said, "There should be thousands of soldiers there. According to the calculations, it shouldn't be too difficult to go and help. I still reject." "Why?" "First, I didn't receive any military orders. Second, you don't have the right to give military orders. Third, without any information support from the battlefield, blindly going to help out of impulse is not a decision that a qualified commander should make. Fourth, I won't use my people to take risks." Su Lu knew that this Commander Dongfang and Xiaoqing were loyal subordinates that were most appreciated by Du Xiaoqing. At this moment, he finally felt that this commander's style of command was indeed meticulous. However, he didn't know how to adapt and was blindly cold and mechanical. He didn't learn the true temperament of teacher Du Xiaoqing. So he said, "Then you can get lost." Chapter 513. Su Lu stared at the screen in silence. He knew very well that if the troops trapped in the snowstorm today were the government troops, even if it was the new 17th Division that had a deep grudge with the Iron 7th Division, Commander Dongfang would definitely not hesitate to go to the rescue instead of waiting for any orders. What the trapped troops needed the most was the backup firmware for the command system. The 1st Regiment of the Iron 7th Division was very close to the battle zone, so it would not be too difficult to rescue them. Compared to leaving them in the lurch, using a mechanical squad to rescue thousands of people was a very simple choice. However, the troops trapped in the snowstorm were part of the Special Forces 1st Division. This was a troop from the anti-government forces from Green Dragon Mountain. So, Commander Dongfang did not hesitate to reject the request for help. If the federal military had its own supporters, then the Green Dragon Mountain troops that were transferred to the front lines because of the Federation's reconciliation agreement were undoubtedly the most hated enemy of the government troops. During the battle at Yellow Mountain Ridge in the south last year, Du Xiaoqing ordered Su Lu to kill people, so he turned around and killed them. He rarely thought about problems other than the situation itself, so he was in a very bad mood right now. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the calculation demonstration on the electronic map. He confirmed that the Imperial Expeditionary Force that trapped the Green Dragon Mountain troops in the northeast, even if it was an entire brigade, would definitely be exhausted. If Du Xiaoqing was here, he would definitely not hesitate to go to the rescue. No, he would take the opportunity to launch a fierce and risky attack to bury the Imperial Expeditionary Force brigade in the glacier and geomagnetic lines, Su Lu thought. As if she could see what Su Lu was thinking, Bai Yulan said softly, "If at this time we ask for help from the Iron 7th Division through the division headquarters, or even give orders through the command center, Commander Du Xiaoqing will not send his own troops because he is protective of his own people. Dongfang Pei has already made a decision. Even if this decision is cold-blooded and mechanical, he will not change it." Yes, Su Lu nodded, thinking that with Du Xiaoqing's personality, he would definitely do such a thing. He couldn't help but feel a trace of regret. He should have let the command center directly negotiate with the Iron 7th Division. Perhaps the situation would have been much better. Su Lu reported the situation in the northeast direction to the division headquarters through the remote communication system that could be maintained for the time being. He then said a few words into the communication device in a low voice. After a moment of silence on the other end of the communication device, the gentle but unquestionable voice of the new 17th Division's commander, Yu Qinghai, came through. This major general, who was known for being a good person, clearly understood Su Li's temperament very well. Without waiting for the camp to make any suggestions, he directly ordered them to immediately retreat to the base and strictly forbade them from providing support. It was normal for the division headquarters to make such a decision. The geographical location of this small unit in the camp was not suitable for them to provide support to the trapped Green Dragon Mountain unit. They also lacked sufficient firepower. More importantly, this unit's mission was to test out the Federation's newest MXD mecha. If these 3 mecha were allowed to fall into the hands of the Empire, who knew what kind of trouble they would cause? These 3 MXD mecha were very valuable, but in the eyes of the new 17th Division, what was even more valuable was the safety of Su Li's lieutenant colonel. Hearing Commander Yu's rare, strict military order, Su Li's expression froze slightly. He placed both hands on the table and stared at the dense geomagnetic lines represented by the dark clouds and red lines in the northeast direction on the screen. Bai Yulan, Lan Xiaolong, and the other officers relaxed. They were all brave soldiers, but they were still unwilling to take the risk of going to the dark clouds in the northeast. This was because, in the depths of their hearts, they had never truly seen the people of Green Dragon Mountain as their comrades. Su Lu slowly straightened his body. At this moment, perhaps he was thinking of the thousands of corpses of Federation civilians not too far away. Perhaps he was thinking of the little girl's gray face. Perhaps he was thinking of the question he had asked himself last night about what he could do for this war. But in reality, he had not thought of anything. He had only instinctively made a decision. He turned around to look at Gu Shifeng. Her subordinates had received the message he wanted to convey. Gu Shifeng's expression froze slightly, and then a bitter, self-mocking smile appeared on her face. The 5 stubby fingers of her right hand quickly swept over the buttons on the workbench. More than 10 electrical commands flowed into the system. The line on the screen that represented the strength of the signal to the division began to flicker incessantly before finally disappearing. Reporting, "The geomagnetic field has changed. Communication has been cut off again," said Gu Shifeng with a shrug. Everyone, including Su Lu, couldn't help but laugh. Although these Federation soldiers were not very willing to take the risk for Green Dragon Mountain, since their boss had already made the decision, they adjusted their emotions in an extremely short amount of time and began to prepare for departure. The safest method of support, which also has the lowest possibility of losses, is to send out 2 mecha as transport vehicles. As Lan Xiaolong sorted out the data, He pointed at the huge white mecha outside and said, "But the problem is that these 3 MXDs are all test prototypes. One of them has already exploded, and no one knows if the same thing will happen again if we do a super strength leap." Before Su Lu could answer his question, Shang Xiu calmly said from the side, "Since they didn't explode, it means that these 2 mecha's adjustments are perfect. The test was successful, and they can be used." With her position in the mecha research world, the calmer she was when she said this, the more confident she appeared, so the team members no longer had any objections. No matter how bad the equipment of the Special Forces is, they're still better than the beggars of the Empire. They should be able to hold out for long enough. Sulu put on his pilot's uniform and lowered his head to pick up the black workbench. He said, "As long as we are fast enough, the Empire's people won't be able to threaten us at all. The biggest problem is the geomagnetic storm and the blizzard. Also, don't forget that the Empire's people still have mecha." Bai Yulan leaned against Xiong Linchuan's thick back and began to change her equipment. She reminded him seriously, "Since we are only going to provide support, boss, you must not act like a hero anymore. Otherwise, when you make the report, you will be criticized even more severely." Su Lu replied, "In the training base, Teacher Xiaoqing has already criticized me severely. You don't have to repeat it." The soldiers in the camp had all heard about the past from the members of Group 7 or the officers who had been trained. That was the arrogant past between Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu and Teacher Xiaoqing. Hearing him say this now, they couldn't help but laugh out loud. Just by filtering the broadband call for help from the previous test, they couldn't pinpoint the exact location of the trapped Green Dragon Mountain. They could only make a rough estimate. They had voluntarily cut off communication with the division headquarters, so naturally, they couldn't expect to be able to obtain the military deployment before the geomagnetic storm. However, this wasn't a problem for Su Lu. He stood in the vast expanse of snow, put on his sunglasses, and was silent for 2 seconds. The old thing then transmitted the data into his brain. The humming of the motors rang out. The experienced soldiers, under Shang Xiu's instructions, quickly modified a white MXD mecha, emptying out most of the space to store the spare parts that the Green Dragon Mountain troops urgently needed. "We are only a testing team. Our levels are not equal. There is no way we can find enough parts." Gu Shifeng stood under the mecha and shouted up, "If we just go like this, there is no guarantee that we will be able to fix their heads. Don't be afraid. I am a very, very high-level mechanic." Su Lu climbed to the side of the cockpit and said to the ground with a smile. Then, his expression froze because he saw Shang Xiu climbing up. "Don't look at me like that." Shang Xiu huffed and puffed as she stood on the heavy cockpit door of the mecha and said, "I am not one of those pretty vases in the movies who likes to join in on the fun and ruin things the most." She looked at Su Lu and said in a more serious tone, "I am a very, very high-level mechanic. The Q7 model battlefield command system was developed by the engineering department. Can you find a reason for me not to go?" Su Lu, who was holding the black workbench, was slightly taken aback. He didn't want others to discover his secret of operating a mecha, but last night, he had already figured out all of this girl's secrets. At this point, he couldn't think of any reason to refuse. The soldiers at the foot of the mecha were once again stunned by Shang Xiu's words. They raised their heads to look at the young man and woman at the belly of the mecha, thinking to themselves that this was really the most impressive pair of youngsters in the Federation. "Looks like the chances of me shining in the future will become fewer and fewer." Gu Shifeng looked at this scene and thought to herself sorrowfully. She turned and walked back into the camp, shaking her head as she walked, extremely emotional. "Let's go." On the narrow platform of the snowy river, the 2 snow-white mecha were like giant blocks of ice that had suddenly loosened. They slowly left the ice cliff and headed northeast. Su Lu and Shang Xiu sat in the first mecha, which was fully loaded with firepower. Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan operated the fully loaded mecha behind them. The 2 snow-white mecha avoided the pitch-black line in front of them, gradually disappearing into the soft snowflakes and the weak but cold northern wind. In the dim cockpit, Shang Xiu's gaze was lowered slightly as she looked at the touchscreen in front of her. The strap had already popped out automatically, tying her securely to her seat. However, it didn't affect her operation. Her input speed wasn't fast, and the commands were also exceptionally simple. However, after just 11 seconds, the MXD mecha's self-check and posture adjustment work was completed. "That's amazing," Sulu said seriously as she watched her play. Shang Qiu didn't even raise her head as she said calmly, "Don't forget, MX wasn't developed by you alone. I've always thought that you were the main contributor to MX's development. I'm his mother. However, there's a saying that you're the father of MX?" Shang Qiu suddenly raised her head and glanced at him with a smile. The MXD mecha couldn't use its movement mode in the slippery and steep glacial terrain. It could only rely on its thick and heavy alloy mechanical legs to continuously dodge and leap forward. No matter how good the shock absorption system was, it couldn't completely eliminate the vibration. Sulu seemed to be stunned by the shock, swallowing back the words he was about to say. He placed the black workbench into the holding room behind the seat, and the automatic strap popped out immediately. A meaningful look flashed through Shang Qiu's eyes as she asked, "This is your pressurized case?" Before Sulu could answer, Bai Yulan's voice rang out from the system, requesting synchronization mode. Mode approved. He pressed the third button beside the control stick. The two Snow White mecha used the naked eye to maintain the distance between each other as they sped through the rugged glacial terrain, moving further and further away. Chapter 514. This was the season of autumn. The dense to the point of being somewhat crowded, and the primeval forest was filled with the color of gold. Squirrels darted swiftly through the branches, breathing out hot air as they worked intimately with the pine trees, preparing for the last and most sumptuous dinner. Snow had already accumulated at the edge of the forest. Looking north from here, the majestic and magnificent snowy mountains and those pale blue glaciers could be clearly seen. The temporary camp of the new 17th Division headquarters was in the circular base at the edge of the forest. This base, which had been operated by the Empire for several decades, had been badly damaged by the Federal Army's counterattack, but many of the building blocks were still intact. In a room on the third floor of the base, more than 10 Federation officers stared at the communication station that had suddenly lost all sound. Their expressions were somewhat stiff, and then they collectively turned their heads to look at the division commander who was staring blankly at the wide electronic map. They knew very well that no one could control that young deputy division commander, but this was the Federal Army after all. For Lieutenant Colonel Sulu to actually cut off the division's communication just like that was really quite outrageous. More importantly, the officers guessed what that mecha testing team far north was preparing to do at this time, so their expressions grew increasingly heavy. They really wanted to know how their division commander would react. The commander of the new 17th Division, the federal military's famous good guy, Major General Yu Qinghai, was silent for a moment under the gazes of his many subordinates. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed. There was no self-deprecation in his laugh. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu even dared to cut off the Bureau of Proclamations channel, so I'm not surprised. Seeing Division Commander Yu's reaction, the officers of the division headquarters felt slightly strange, but they immediately understood. They lowered their heads somewhat awkwardly, thinking that they should have guessed earlier that this slightly plump and gentle division commander would not have the courage to do anything. However, right at this moment, Division Commander Yu Qinghai surprised everyone. He smiled warmly and said, "Inform Commander He to have his 1st Regiment enter combat mode. Prepare to move north within 4 hours. Young staff officers, ask for the location of the Azure Dragon. Special Forces 1st Army before the geomagnetic storm. 2nd Regiment and 3rd Regiment slowly approach from the direction of Poling G towards the northwest. Pay attention, stay away from those guys from the Iron 7th Division. If you encounter Dongfang Pei's regiment, just ignore it." The officers in the room stared blankly at their division commander, unable to digest these words in a short period of time. Division commander was preparing for the entire division to go out and provide support. In everyone's eyes, this was the same person who only knew how to eat to his heart's content, who spoke softly to his superiors and subordinates, who laughed foolishly, and who lacked courage. Was this the same person who was useless? Teacher Yu Qinghai, who was already over 50 years old, scratched the white hair on his head. Looking at his subordinates who were looking at each other in dismay, he gently smiled and said, "What are you still doing here? Could it be that you really don't treat me as your teacher?" Only then did the officers wake up. With a trace of excitement, 30% confusion, and 60% doubt, they saluted in unison and prepared to carry out the orders of the division commander. However, their movements were still somewhat hesitant. Deputy Chief of Staff Ning, he couldn't figure out what was wrong with Commander Yu today, either. He lowered his voice and reminded him, "The situation has been reported to space, but there has been no reply from the headquarters regarding the trapped special forces. Moreover, the geomagnetic storm and snowstorm are still going on over there. The situation is unclear." Commander Yu Qinghai waved his hand and interrupted Ning He's words. A smile of understanding flashed across his slightly chubby face. He looked at his subordinates in the room and said, "Actually, we all know that it does seem a little strange for me to be the division commander of the new 17th Division. You must know that the most amazing job I have in the army is actually just to cook for the division commander." Since the division commander was in the mood to tell a joke, as his subordinates, they naturally had to respond with a smile. However, there was another emotion in their smiles because what Commander Yu said was true. Although it seemed to be a kind of glory that the war god was only willing to eat his cooking, it was definitely not a good qualification in the army. On the bloody battlefield, the word good guy was synonymous with good for nothing. In fact, there were many high-ranking generals within the federal military who looked down on Yu Qinghai. They had great objections to him taking the position of division commander of the new 17th Division, which had a strong symbolic meaning. Regarding the position of division commander of the new 17th Division, who knew how many commanders of powerful field armies, and even the chief of staff of military regions, were willing to lower themselves a few ranks to take up the position. In the end, after so much fighting, this position actually landed on the head of a chef. Who could be convinced? All of the middle and high-ranking officers of the new 17th Division were the targets that the Federation focused on cultivating. For such a good guy to be the division commander, it was hard to say that they weren't disappointed and angry in the depths of their hearts. But who said that chefs don't know how to fight? Yu Qinghai smiled so much that his eyes narrowed. For the first time, the officers in the room felt a certain sense of valiance from him. Back in the day, the division commander grew up in the Westwoods. On the mainland of the Empire, in countless battles, he was used to making the most important decisions during meals. I was very honored that I stood by his side at that time. This means that I have watched the Federation War God's tactical deduction process countless times. No one in the entire Federal Army can compare to me in this aspect. Commander Yu Qinghai's face suddenly glowed with a smug luster. He said, "The Federation's proverb says that if you familiarize yourself with 10,000 books, you will naturally become an excellent writer. I have seen and memorized the division commander's countless battle examples. No matter how incompetent I am, I can still remember some things that a commander needs to remember." In the later stages of the Second World War, the old division commander once used a battle example to educate me. If there is a variable that is beyond the control of both sides on the battlefield, then what we need to do is to actively respond and actively welcome the changes that this variable may bring, no matter whether this change is good or bad. No one knows whether Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu can fix the Special Forces 1st Division. Damn it, the command system of those bastards from Green Dragon Mountain. But there is always this possibility. As long as it is possible, the large army that the Empire's people put in the ambush will be held back for one more day. And we need this time to wait for he lays a 1st Division to move into position. Don't pay attention to those guys from the 7th Division. Dong Fong Pei will definitely be scolded after this. Such a big piece of fat meat is right in front of him, and he didn't eat it. How angry will Commander Xiaoqing, who has been hungry for so many days, be? Red braised pork is the best with rice. Right now, there's a plate of red braised pork waiting for us. If we still wait for orders from the headquarters, although this is in line with the etiquette of guests, it is also very stupid. The Empire doesn't have a reserve team. That is the magnetic storm area. Just use your brain a little, and you will know the reason for this ambush. Helay's 1st Division is the furthest away from the designated battle area, but he is Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's student. He should know very well what Su Li will do and how long it will take. So, he must give the 1st Division enough autonomy to be mobile and chase after them. The 2nd Division and the 3rd Division will form 2 fronts and advance together. The sky here is full of the Federation's eyes and fighters, so there is no problem with safety. Directly entering the magnetic storm area takes the shortest amount of time, so they must control their speed. Once they enter the magnetic storm area, leave immediately and follow the line of the glacier to further north. Everyone, don't pay attention to the battle situation of the enemy or how many Empire soldiers are there. This will definitely be a chaotic battle. Commander Yu Qinghai pointed at the electronic map and explained calmly. It was as if he was explaining how a dish should be cooked. He did it so effortlessly and casually. The officers of the 17th Division quietly listened to their commander's lecture. Their expressions were very serious, and their eyes gradually revealed a look of admiration. Yu Qinghai smiled gently and ended his tactical arrangement. He looked at his subordinates and said, "Just like the 7th Division's crazy pursuit to the north in the Yellow Mountain Ridge last year, once we enter the magnetic storm area, we will split up. Later, we will issue the strictest military order to the company-level combat units. Once they discover that they cannot beat the Empire soldiers, they are to run immediately. As for where to run, that is up to them to decide. Don't forget that our 17th Division is a fully mechanized force. Now, the Department of National Defense has stuffed in so many mechas that make me dizzy. When it comes to running, who can be faster than us? With the additional system designed by Lieutenant Colonel Su Li, I believe that these mechas will not fall into a trap again." Commander Yu Qinghai raised an eyebrow and smiled. As a commander, I should not be explaining these tactical arrangements to you all, but there are not many true veterans in the division. As a commander, my greatest responsibility is to pass down the fighting style of the old commander when he led the 17th Division. Of course, if General Miles were to be the commander himself, perhaps he would do a better job. You must know that on the battlefield back then, he was known for being the most sinister and ruthless. But I think the president would not agree. Commander Yu Qinghai spread out his arms and said with a serious expression, "Children, you must remember that the great, undefeated 17th Division only has one fighting style, and that is to eat all the meat that can be eaten, to love every piece of meat on our bodies. For this purpose, there is no such thing as the word shameless in our eyes." Su Li did not know what had happened at the division headquarters. He also did not know that the 17th Division that had been brought up by that old man in Feiqing was definitely not as honorable and disciplined as the Federation citizens thought. In reality, although he used all his free time to study military command and had also commanded 7th Division in some small-scale battles, he still could not be considered an excellent commander. Putting aside those hot-blooded individual heroism, he still habitually used his superior combat ability to solve the problems he faced while in a mecha. The twin engines of the Snow White MXD mecha hummed. The micro-turbine in the T-section did not make any noise, but it silently provided more power. The superfine alloy spikes protruded from the mechanical legs of the mecha, like the fine hairs on the edge of cat's paw. They rubbed against the smooth ice surface forcefully, causing the two mechas to become two white lines. Although it was difficult to be silent, they advanced at an exceptionally high speed. The snowstorm grew stronger and stronger. The two mechas in synchronized mode simultaneously emitted a warning of strong magnetic interference. Relying on a naked eye, they did not separate, but they were still blurred between the wind, snow, glacier, and black clouds, like two flies bumping into each other for who knew how long. And then they crashed headfirst into the battlefield. Two white mechas stood on top of the glacier, looking down at the armored vehicles that were emitting black smoke. The corpses of the fallen soldiers were motionless as they listened to the sporadic gunshots. They seemed to be looking for a way to enter the center of the battlefield. Chapter 5:15. The ground was a vast expanse of snow, but the sky was heavy with dark clouds. In addition to the black smoke that rose into the air and drifted in all directions with the wind and snow, the light seemed somewhat dim. Sporadic gunshots rang out from all directions from time to time. Whether it was the Imperial Expeditionary Force hidden in the glaciers or the Green Dragon Mountain troops that had been unexpectedly ambushed, they all seemed to have been frozen by the bitter cold. Their shouts and hot-bloodedness could only be monotonously pulled on the triggers, firing bullets forward, splashing the ice and snow on the ground, or knocking down an enemy. No one noticed that halfway up the steep icy peak to the southwest, there were two snow-white Federation mecha quietly half-buried in the deep snow. They had already entered the active geomagnetic zone. The MXD mecha's SCC monitoring system and large radius high-sensitivity radar were all under strong interference. Warning characters flashed on the screen from time to time, and a light red light lit up in the cockpit. Sulu didn't pay attention to these problems. He silently watched the screen's vision, watching the battle scenes on the snowy battlefield closest to him that moved him. Shang Xiao was currently beside him, performing operations to eliminate interference. His movements were as smooth and concise as usual. As the chief research engineer of MX, a true genius, even if he were to do this work, he wouldn't be able to do it better. With a light beep, the two white mecha in a synchronized state recovered most of their electronic functions at almost the same time. Relying on manual operations couldn't go against the mysterious nature, but it could recover some of the losses. Through the calculations of the onboard computer and the observation of the naked eye, Sulu roughly determined the scope of the battle area. The trapped Green Dragon Mountain troops were more than expected, roughly 2,000 people. Presumably, before they were ambushed, they should have been close to a proper regiment's establishment, but this Green Dragon Mountain troops were now scattered into countless scattered small teams, fighting in a glacial region that was dozens of square kilometers in size. This kind of situation was truly not good. If they couldn't repair their command system as soon as possible, then this troop's destruction was only a matter of time. Boom, boom, several muffled explosions came from the distance of the glaciers. Then, sporadic gunshots rang out, and the pained cries of the wounded could be faintly heard. "Have you found their regiment headquarters?" Sulu quickly asked the system. His eyes searched for the path to the center of the war zone in the grayish-white world on the screen. What troubled him was that although the Empire's firepower did not seem to be very strong, there were obviously many hidden heavy firepower points in front of him. The lateral filtering can only be accurate up to 500 meters. Bai Yulan's voice rang out from the cockpit. "They're roughly 7 kilometers to the east. Our luck is pretty good. Their regimental headquarters isn't in the central region, and they're quite close to us. If this regimental headquarters is really at the furthest point, no one would be able to find them." "Got it." Sulu let go of the joystick, turned back to the chair, and took out the black workbench box, preparing for battle. Between the glaciers in the direction of the Green Dragon Mountain Regiment Division, there should be many Empire firing points. However, the sky was already gradually darkening. Apart from forcefully charging over, there didn't seem to be many other choices. "Your press box seems to be smaller than the previous one." Shang Xiao adjusted the glasses on the bridge of her nose and suddenly said, "This is a gift from someone. Please keep what you see a secret." Sulu replied. He didn't explain that this was a gift from Jian Shuier through a special channel. It was a new type of simulation system specially designed for the Lees of Philadelphia. He took off his pilot's uniform, revealing his well-proportioned and muscular body. He began to put on this set of equipment that was much lighter than the simulation system he had assembled himself. Beside him, Shang Xiao took off her glasses in surprise, but didn't say anything. A strange light flashed through her eyes. It had been a long time since he had used a mecha in battle. Su Li's body that was suspended in the air exerted some force. His left knee bent slightly, and he felt the familiar tingling sensation of numbness on his skin. He felt the strength of each of his pores as he listened to the familiar sound of hydraulics coming from the mecha below him. He couldn't help but take a deep breath. He felt some kind of powerful and intoxicating strength return to his body. Following his movements, the white MXD mecha that had been quietly hiding in the wind and snow all this time lowered its left knee slightly and slowly stood up. According to the plan they had drawn up beforehand, their goal was to support the Green Dragon Mountain Regiment Division headquarters, not to the point where they were crazy enough to want to defeat the entire battalion of the Imperial Expeditionary Force with just 2 mecha. Su Li's mecha would act as the vanguard or bait, drawing the firepower of the Empire soldiers from the outskirts of the battle zone. He would forcibly tear open a path and cover by Yulan's mecha as they quickly passed through the outskirts of the battle zone to reach their destination. The white MXD at the back followed the former's movements and slowly stood up as well. Its twin engines emitted a low hum, shaking off the snow on its body to the ground. In the cockpit of the mecha, Xiong Linquan silently prepared the firepower system. Bai Yulan looked at the not-so-intense, but exceptionally bloody and cruel battle through the screen. She said to the system in a heavy tone, "Be careful. This batch of Empire soldiers is crazier than the ones we've encountered before." Yes, in the 3 planetary systems, the Imperial Expeditionary Force that had already reached the end of their road had already sunk into the final frenzy before they died. This was especially so on planet 5460, where the situation was the most bleak. Although the headquarters led by old General Ambly still had tens of thousands of soldiers under control, the miserable situation where there was no retreat and no path forward had caused the Empire soldiers to enter a state of madness that was bordering on suicidal. Because of the snowstorm and geomagnetic storm, the Imperial Expeditionary Force was very lucky to have surrounded a Federal Army unit. They gathered an entire battalion of soldiers and launched an attack on this Federal Army unit. They knew very well that their equipment and ammunition were on the brink of depletion, far inferior to the Federal Army. Even if this ambush was successful, their troops would have to pay a heavy price. They also knew very well that even if they completely annihilated this Federal Army unit, it would not change the cruel fact that the Empire had been annihilated in the West Woods. But so what? In the moment before death, they suddenly found that they could kill more enemies before they died. How could they not seize this opportunity? The people of the Empire didn't even care what the Federation unit's designation was. In their eyes, there was no difference between the Federation Army and the anti-government army. They were all people of the Federation, so they all deserved to die. On a snowy slope, a dozen or so Empire soldiers were currently advancing towards the Green Dragon Mountain unit. They didn't shout, didn't yell, only with sunken faces and red eyes. They stepped over the already dead and stiff corpses of their comrades and pulled the triggers with all their might. The metal triggers were as terrifying as soldering iron from the severe cold. Their fingers had long festered to the bone, but their shooting movements were still incomparably accurate and meticulous. The whistling bullets flew past, striking the eye of an Empire soldier. Flowers of blood and brain matter spurted out at the same time, but he didn't immediately fall down. Instead, he relied on some sort of instinct before death to fire the last 2 bullets forward. Only when the Federation people's follow-up bullets struck his chest into a mess did he willingly fall onto the ice and snow. His 2 legs twitched slightly, and then he didn't make any more movements, dying as if he had been freed. 3 kilometers to the northwest, the Green Dragon Mountain unit's side defensive line was finally broken through. 300 Empire soldiers launched an attack on this unit that had been defending alone for a day and night. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers clenched their teeth and continuously fired. The 300 Empire soldiers, however, didn't fire back. Instead, they faced the bullets of death and advanced with difficulty on the snowy ground, doing their best to close the firing distance. They didn't care that their comrades were constantly falling beside them. In reality, when their comrades fell, the Empire soldiers' faces didn't show any emotion. They only calmly bent down to pick up their comrades' guns and then charged forward again. This was because they understood extremely clearly that their guns only had a single magazine, and every single bullet had to be displayed to its greatest effect. In this type of hopeless situation, human lives would never be as important as ammunition. When the 300 Empire soldiers charged into a certain Green Dragon Mountain unit, only half of them remained. A bitter close-range shooting battle abruptly unfolded in that snowy plain. The crazy Empire soldiers didn't care about the danger of sputtering fire at close range at all, and they even more so didn't care about whether or not they would accidentally injure their comrades in this small area. Gunshots suddenly sounded. Roughly 3 minutes later, the desolation stopped. All that was left was a sea of corpses and heavily injured people howling in pain, as well as more than 10 Empire soldiers whose eyes flickered with ruthless and crazy radiance. Right at this time, a Green Dragon Mountain soldier whose legs were blown off cracked open his mouth and laughed. Then he opened the sensor grenade in his hands, detonating the ammo box behind him. A muffled sound rang through the air, followed by a blast of smoke and a streak of black smoke. A certain Green Dragon Mountain unit fell, and the 300 Empire soldiers also all died in battle. The Imperial Expeditionary Force and Green Dragon Mountain's troops were scattered between the glaciers and snowy plains, tangled up in a chaotic battle. The intense battle had already continued for a day and 2 nights. Scenes of desperate battles like this occurred in every corner of this snowy region war zone. Neither side who were engaged in an intense battle had the time to bury the corpses. However, because the battlefield was scattered far and wide, the soldiers' corpses lying everywhere didn't give off a densely packed feeling. The blood that gushed out from the wounds was frozen into red crystals, and there wasn't too much of a blood-soaked battlefield atmosphere either. Within the spacious glaciers and snowy plains, the thousands of corpses were like black punctuation marks, decorating a crazy article. Within the countless battle positions, whenever the smoke and cliffs scattered, soldiers from both sides could always be seen. Their bodies had long been frozen stiff, but they still stubbornly tangled together. The military spears in their hands pierced into each other's bodies, electrocuting the other party's military uniform into charred paste. A certain Green Dragon Mountain regiment of 3,400 people only had 2,000 people left. Meanwhile, in this large army of over 10,000 people, because of this crazy, suicidal style of battle, who knew how many people had died? The Empire's people had all gone crazy. They bent their bodies that were frozen by the wind and snow, continuously surging towards Green Dragon Mountain's position. They held guns wrapped in rags, stepped on their ripped military boots, and moved forward one after another to commit suicide or kill others. Those who didn't personally witness this battle would never be able to understand this kind of desperate and crazy atmosphere that pervaded the snowy plains. They would never be able to imagine what the bitter bottom line of this battle was. This wasn't the last grenade that would end in mutual destruction, nor was it a situation where one's expression didn't change when facing a white blade. Instead, it was a type of cold environment that was silent to the point of making people go crazy. Each side didn't yield an inch, exchanging life for life as a matter of course, without a change in expression. This was a battle that was destined to be recorded in the annals of the Federation's military history. Facing the frantic attacks of the Empire's people who had staked everything on a single throw, this Azure Dragon Mountain troop, that was much smaller in number, had persisted until now. Like a hardbone, they had held on for 2 days and 1 night. They weren't scared by the Empire's madness. Even though the regiment headquarters on the outskirts of the battle zone had lost control of the overall situation because of the damage to their command system, they still didn't think about retreating at all. It was because they came from Green Dragon Mountain, from the silent but hardworking lower-class people. It was because they were people of the Federation, and this was the land of the Federation. Chapter 516. No matter how intense and crazy a battle was, after continuing for 2 days and 1 night, they would all gradually enter small-scale battle mode. This was especially the case in such a large expanse of glaciers and snowy plains. Both sides of the Federation and Empire were mostly fighting over an extremely small tactical location. The Green Dragon Mountain troops, whose command system was severely damaged, In a situation where they didn't have any clear orders from their superiors, stubbornly defended the position they stood on. Meanwhile, the Empire of Despair's people who no longer needed to be commanded launched attacks towards every position they could see. The position was lost, and then it was taken back. Neither of the valiant and persevering sides cared about battle losses or whether or not they could survive. Their red eyes only stared at the vast expanse of white, snowy plains. There were small-scale battles everywhere. Meanwhile, these small team battles without heavy firepower support were in reality even more naked and bloody than the clashes of armored streams and high-performance mecha battles. Without full metal shells, the humans from different star regions, relying on their own bodies and the firearms in their hands, played out scene after scene of instinctive cruelty. In the two white mechas at the waistline of the glaciers, the light screens clearly captured the battle scenes. These scenes made the hearts of Sue Lee's group of four cold. While the Empire's people were going crazy in the face of death, they also developed endless respect for this impressive Green Dragon Mountain troops. It was precisely because of this that they didn't have the time to think about a more perfect plan. Instead, they chose the most direct, two-pronged assault tactic. Thus, in the next instant, the hundreds of soldiers from both sides who were silently fighting outside the snowy plains saw a scene they would never forget. The low and powerful rumbling of twin engines instantly sounded from above the glaciers. All around the snowy plains, heavy drum-like sounds suddenly rang out. The ice and snow that had condensed for millions of years suddenly exploded. There was a snowstorm here, but the ice and snow suddenly exploded, sending out countless pieces of snow that swept away all of the snowflakes in the sky. A snow-white mecha, in a situation no one could foresee, suddenly shot out with a rumble from this exploding mass of snow. The white MXD mecha was like an ice giant. Carrying the wind and snow around its body, it rushed down the steep snowy slope with a shocking speed. The heavy body stomped on the snow, every step leaving a half-meter deep crater. Every time it lifted its knees, it would cross 50 meters in an instant. Amidst the screeching, it only took a moment for the white mecha to reach the edge of the snowfield where the Imperial troops were stationed. Kacha kacha kacha. The clear and chilling sound of metal clashing against metal penetrated the oppressive and suffocating battlefield, suppressing the distant sounds of explosions and the scattered gunfire nearby, piercing the eardrums of the warriors on both sides. The white mecha raised its heavy mechanical arm horizontally in the midst of its high-speed assault, and that thick gun barrel actually seemed so terrifying at this moment. The warriors on both sides stared blankly at the godlike mecha and finally reacted. They screamed and cursed in different languages as they desperately retreated back to their own positions. The white MXD suddenly opened fire. The body of the MXD shook slightly, but it didn't slow down at all. 6 streams of gunfire roared out from its mechanical arm, twisting into a beautiful line of fire and fiercely shooting at the Empire's position. Pop, 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 pop. Darren's specially made bullets that carried extremely high momentum fiercely shot out. Countless amounts of snow and black soil were overturned and sputtered. In an instant, more than 10 Empire soldiers were shot into corpses that littered the ground. The simple and crude position was like a beach after a flood under the violent barrage of bullets, a complete mess. Following the shooting, the white MXD mecha still maintained an extremely exaggerated speed. Against the background of the white snowfield, it had already become a dizzying line. The white mecha was at the front of this line. Snow blocked, snow scattered, ice blocked, ice broke. People died if they tried to stop it. The white mecha charged straight into the battlefield like a hatchet. Its momentum was astonishing. The continuous and fierce firing of Darren's autocannon was like the bright light of this giant hatchet that cut through the snow. Those who came in contact with it would die. After 10 seconds or so, the mecha had already broken through the ice palace. Under the stunned gazes of the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers, before their eyes even had time to produce feelings of surprise, it turned the Empire's position at the outermost edge into a sea of fire. Perhaps it was because the white MXD controlled by Su Lu was like a god descending on the battlefield, announcing its arrival to both sides in an overly arrogant manner. Therefore, at this moment, not many people noticed that there was still a snow-white Federation mecha silently following behind it at a distance of 1,500 meters to its right. In order to keep up with Su Li's speed, the mecha controlled by Bai Yulan had entered an overclock state when it started its assault from the waistline of the glacier. Accompanied by the low humming of its twin engines, this mecha that carried the parts that the Green Dragon Mountain troops urgently needed valiantly displayed its maximum mobility. Using the cover of the wind and snow, smoke and ice, it quickly drove towards the high ground where the Green Dragon Mountain Regiment headquarters was located. Green Dragon Mountain soldiers were all stupefied by the scene before their eyes. After 2 days and 1 night of brutal battle, even though they were the Green Dragon Mountain troops who possessed extremely high awareness and discipline, they still began to feel fatigue and the most terrifying numbness. It was to the extent that when that white mecha hacked into the Empire's troops like a giant axe, not a single person understood what had happened. By the time they reacted, the white mecha had already charged to the second Empire position at the edge of the battle zone. Dozens of Green Dragon Mountain soldiers roared in ecstasy. Clutching the guns in their hands that were already running low on ammunition, they stepped through the thick snow and charged over. The Empire soldiers were also stunned, staring blankly at this scene. They watched as the white MXT easily annihilated one of their positions, and then, without hesitation, charged towards the second position. They watched as the bodies of their comrades were sent flying by the tall and large Federation mecha. That mecha's cannon fire easily tore apart the sturdy three-dimensional bulletproof shields. The bulletproof shields that protected their lives instantly became dangerous metal flowers, exploding in all directions. The sharp metal shards the size of palms sliced many of their comrades' bodies into wretched lumps of flesh, while their counterattacks seemed so weak and powerless. The hastily organized counterattacks of the positions were completely ineffective. Normal firearms and bullets could not hit the high-speed, moving white mecha at all. Even if a few stray bullets did hit, they could only let out a few mournful chirps, unable to leave any damage to the opponent. Even the few spike-type anti-mecha rocket projectiles that were shot out diagonally from the ice cliffs were completely unable to keep up with that Federation mecha's terrifying speed and unimaginable dodging movements. The last soldiers of the Imperial Expeditionary Force were originally fighting with a crazy attitude of committing suicide in order to serve His Majesty. They were not afraid of death, but at this moment, this Federation white mecha charged into their midst like a demon, as if it had been bestowed with some kind of power, making them feel a sense of despair that they could not take it down at all. This was a cursed Federation mecha. Otherwise, how could it have such fast speed and such inconceivable dodging movements? In this universe, even the best pilots would not be able to perform this kind of operation. Compared to the ordinary soldiers of the Empire who were stunned, their commanding officers had much stronger nerves. Although they were the most basic officers, at this moment, they displayed the excellent training standards of the Empire's military. They lay in the snow pits and ice traps, delaying the arrival of death amidst the sounds of gunfire and snow. They stared fixedly at the white mecha of the Federation that was dancing and killing people with bloodshot eyes. Through the command system, they called for backup, helping the heavy firepower troops to lock onto this damn mecha and give it a fatal blow. The snowy plains were filled with curses and angry howls in the Empire's language. The heavy firepower troops of the Empire made an accurate response in the shortest amount of time. At a 42-degree angle to the northwest, a formation of grenades that had been prepared to shoot horizontally and densely, without any hesitation, spewed out countless projectiles towards their own positions. The Imperial commander clearly knew that under this kind of dense bombardment, that Federation mecha would definitely explode and die, and he and all of his subordinates who had not yet died would also lose their lives along with it. However, his positioning call never paused in the slightest, incomparably calm and callous. The densely packed grenades shot through the wind and snow, instantly covering the entire position, shooting towards that incomparably powerful white mecha that was silently dodging in the position. At the same time, the Imperial commander finally discovered the other white Federation mecha behind. Out of some kind of danger, intuition, and sensitivity on the battlefield, a batch of mechanical troops began to move at high speed in that direction, wanting to surround that silent white mecha. Go to hell, devil! That Imperial commander who was hiding in the ice crevice, risking his life to locate the Federation mecha, did not feel that his calf had already been cut off by a piece of metal at all. He stared fixedly at that white Federation mecha, and when he heard the shrill howls of the dense bamboo root grenades in the air, he gritted his teeth and cursed. Boom! 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 The entire snowy plains began to tremble. Countless horizontally fired cannons whistled through the formation, bombarding the snowy plains even further away. 3 batches of 3D cannons, one after another, exploded at high speed, ruthlessly plowing through the snowy plains with metal shrapnel and high-temperature flames from afar. That Imperial commander was shaken up by the explosion that landed not too far away from him. The intense shock wave blew his body out of the ice crevice, throwing him into the sky. He rolled in the snow, but there was not much sadness in his wide, open brown eyes. Instead, there was a hint of crazed excitement before death. He could almost see that white Federation mecha exploding into a sky full of fireworks just like him. However, the heavens played the final joke on this Imperial commander. He saw that white mecha tumbling in the air like him, but he did not see the other mecha explode. He fell heavily onto the snowy plains, his mouth and nose full of blood from the shock. He opened his red eyes unwillingly, and before he stopped breathing for the last time, his brown eyes were filled with disbelief and pain. Just like this Imperial commander, the Imperial soldiers in the Sea of Flames and the commanders in charge of observing the effect of the concentrated grenades further away were all stunned by what they saw. They felt cold all over, colder than this cruel world. Faced with the dense and seemingly unavoidable wave of grenades, that white Federation mecha did an action that no one could have imagined. In that instant, the bulky and tall white mecha began to spin and roll, using this strange evasive action in a suffocating and narrow space to avoid all of the grenades around it. Countless amounts of snow and ice were swept up by the high-speed evasive action, becoming a scattering snowflake circle. Within the scattering snowflakes, the smoke and flames of the explosions flickered. This scene was extremely beautiful. Chapter 517. Shrouded in snow and ice, the snow-white mecha made several perfect arcs in the air, brushing past the grenades in what seemed like an extremely dangerous manner. In that split second, it was almost as if the stabilizing wings of the grenades had brushed past the mecha's alloy surface by less than 1 centimeter, leaving a trail of air in the air. A muffled thump rang out like a hammer in everyone's heart. The heavy MXD mecha plummeted from the air towards the ground. Just as it was about to hit the ground, its right mechanical arm shot out rapidly towards the snow. The massive body of the mecha was thwarted by the massive recoil and quickly bounced back up. Before the heavy mechanical legs could even touch the snow, the white body of the mecha began to tremble violently, leaving behind a trail of afterimages as it swept past the surrounding sea of fire and sped towards another part of the Empire's defensive position. From a moment the grenades had arrived, this white mecha that had abruptly entered the battlefield had performed an unimaginable rotation and evasive maneuver to the moment it had bounced off the ground and turned into a straight line to enter the battle once more. In an extremely short amount of time, this entire set of maneuvers had been completed cleanly, without the slightest pause in between. None of the soldiers on both sides of this snowy battlefield had ever seen such mecha control before. In fact, They had never imagined that a seemingly cumbersome and massive mecha could perform such unimaginable maneuvers. Meanwhile, some of the more experienced officers stared at the white mecha that had slaughtered its way into the snowstorm and smoke. They could not help but feel a jolt in their hearts as they thought of a name that had once shaken the universe. Overclocking status denied. T-boost at 60%. SCC half-activated. Warning. Degaussing peak value decreasing. The usual electronically synthesized voice of the mecha cockpit was replaced in today's battle by a slightly trembling but still calm female voice. Even in the full restraint decompression device, Shang Xiu's face was still pale from the series of high-speed mecha maneuvers earlier. She gripped the stabilizer lever in front of her with great difficulty as she stared at the continuously flashing data on the separate screen. She made a mecha engineering report to Su Lu, who was in charge of the controls. The central control computer of the mecha needed to analyze the data in order to produce the correct status report. Shang Xiu, on the other hand, only needed to stare at the data streams that the average person would not be able to understand. Then, she would be able to use her deep-rooted understanding of the mecha to preemptively make the calculations and analysis, and then use human eyes to give the correct suggestions. Shang Xiu understood this MXD mecha very well. Looking at the data, she decisively recommended not to enter overclocking mode. Because of this, she did not have the time to look at Su Lu beside her, who was operating the mecha. However, she knew that he was not using his full strength right now. To be so powerful without using his full strength was truly a shocking fact. Su Lu was not moved in the slightest by the series of mecha evasive maneuvers that could be described as beautiful. He knew that he could do all this. During the graduation day military exercise, he had rushed down from the top of Blue Pond Peak. Facing the grenades of the Iron 7th Division's Guards Battalion, he could even pass through them, let alone the artillery of the Empire. This was a kind of bone-deep confidence. This confidence came from the mysterious power within his body, from the intimate feeling of seamless cooperation between him and the MXD mecha, and even more from his daily training that was more diligent than anyone else. Today, Su Li's mecha piloting skills were even stronger than they had been during the graduation day military exercise. In addition to the new MXD's turbocharging technology, as well as the Face City War God set gifted to him by Jianxue, he did not need to let his mecha enter an unstable overclocking mode to deal with what had seemed like a frightening situation earlier. Shang Xiu's technical cooperation rang out clearly in his ears. Su Lu subconsciously cooperated. At this moment, his entire body and mind had already become one with the giant mecha beneath him, and it was almost impossible to tell them apart. His fingers quickly brushed across the touchscreen as he keyed in one precise command after another. His other hand gripped the control stick firmly, and from time to time, he would use his finger to flick the shortcut button on the stick. The simulation system on his body faithfully reproduced and magnified the muscle movements simulated by the blazing power within his body. Through the onboard system, it was transmitted to every alloy bone and joint of the mecha, allowing the mecha to perform one swift and precise movement after another on the glaciers and snowy plains. After destroying 3 simple Empire defensive positions in succession and dodging 2 concentrated artillery attacks, the Empire troops in this war zone finally understood just how terrifying the power of the White Federation mecha was. Countless angry military orders were passed through the command system, and even more of the heavy armored troops in the central region of the war zone began to move in this direction. The white MXD roared as it passed through a stretch of icy cliffs and finally met a true opponent. Amidst a sky full of snow and wind, for Empire Wolf mechas that had been hiding here for a long time suddenly surrounded it with a boom. These camouflaged Empire mechas were lighter in weight and moved quickly on the surface of the snowy plains. However, they didn't dare to compete in speed with the white MXD in close-range combat. From 200 meters away, they began to blast out powerful onboard firepower. For fiery red bullet lines shot out like awls towards the seemingly unprepared white mecha. The other white MXD that had been silently following the smoke and artillery fire at the front also encountered its first wave of obstruction at this moment. The Empire's heavy firepower troops hurriedly moved over and fired a concentrated barrage of armor-piercing heavy bullets in an attempt to annihilate it. This white mecha was clearly not as crazy and unstoppable as the mecha controlled by Su Lu at the front left. Both of its engines were fully engaged and in an overclocked state, and it still followed the traditional combat mode, carrying out impeccably precise dodging actions. However, what was clearly different was that this white mecha's dodging actions were a little strange. In the eyes of the soldiers on both sides of the snowy plains, when the white mecha was sprinting and sliding to the right, its heavy mechanical arms were unreasonably spread to the left. Darren's cannon fire roared out, shattering the icy cliffs on the left side. This kind of feeling was extremely uncoordinated, like a drunkard holding a bottle of wine and smashing it at the urine stain on the wall. But in the end, it always smashed into the telephone pole by the wall. It was a terrible sight, as if it could be knocked to the ground at any time. However, what was strange was that this white mecha's extremely uncoordinated dodging and firing actions had achieved extremely good results. Not only did it not fall to the ground under the heavy firepower of the Empire's heavy firepower troops, it instead swayed and charged forward at high speed, and those ferocious gunfire reaped the lives of many Empire soldiers. Finally, some of the soldiers understood that this white mecha's operation and shooting seemed to be separated into two completely different systems, and they did not interfere with each other. Multitasking may not be a difficult task, but all of the soldiers knew that a mecha with a complete system would have all links that were interconnected, and it was extremely difficult to forcibly separate them into two parts. However, this white mecha was actually able to do this to such an extent, which could only mean that the pilot's control skills were extremely outstanding. Moreover, he and the person in charge of the firepower system had an extremely good rapport to the point that it made one's hair stand on end. The white mecha ran wildly across the snowy plains, not caring about front or back. The rotating cannons on the mecha's arms roared as they spat out flames, but they did not wildly scatter in all directions to kill the defenseless Empire soldiers. Instead, they accurately transformed into terrifying straight lines that shot out from the mecha's body, mercilessly striking the heavy firepower equipment and blasting a sky full of debris. Inside the cockpit, Xiong Linquan's expression was calm as he controlled the auxiliary screen, controlling the firepower system to make the most effective shots. At the same time, he also had to cooperate with by Yulan's high-speed operation to prevent the mecha's physical performance from being affected. Such a tedious operation did not seem to be able to pressure him, who was in Group 7-second thick nerves. However, at this moment, his expression suddenly became serious, and his brows furrowed. Looking at the image on the SCC window, he shouted loudly, "Boss is trapped." For mechas. Even in the midst of such a fierce battle, Bai Yulan, wearing a helmet, still looked calm and gentle. He stared at the small screen in front of him, quickly operating the mecha, pushing his hand's speed to the limit. Even after hearing Xiong Linquan's anxious shout, he did not react at all. 1 kilometer ahead, the Empire's armored forces were rushing over. This was what he needed to worry about right now. Xiong Linquan shouted, naturally hoping that Bai Yulan would control the mecha to turn to the left to support Su Lu. However, he did not receive any response, and he could not help but be slightly stunned. He knew that Lao Bai and Su Lu had a close relationship, and Lao Bai would definitely not ignore the life and death of his boss. Then, what did this silence mean? The white mecha's right shoulder armor flipped over, and the only main cannon designed by the MXD blasted out, overturning an Empire's heavy armored vehicle 300 meters away. Xiong Linquan pursed his lips tightly, glancing uneasily at the SCC window from the corner of his eyes. However, the uneasiness in his eyes immediately turned into shock and satisfaction. On the screen on the window, 4 wolf mecha that had been in hiding for a long time were launching an ambush at the white MXD controlled by Su Lu. The terrifying projectiles sent snow and ice flying everywhere, somewhat obstructing the view of the battlefield. However, an instant later, the snow and ice fell to the ground, and one of the Empire's mecha roaring with gunfire suddenly froze. This Empire's mecha seemed to have been frozen stiff by the wind and snow, instantly losing all of its power. Then, the engine behind its waist exploded, and the mecha collapsed to the ground. A moment ago, the tall white MXD had been in a half-crouch position on the snowy ground. The next moment, like a ghost, it swept out from behind this exploding mecha. The Dahlen gun at the front of the mechanical arm had long been replaced by a super-sharp special tri-edged alloy blade, instead of the conventional alloy serrated blade. It was precisely this sharp, tri-edged alloy blade that accurately pierced into the gap between the Empire's Wolf mecha's engine compartment, exploding the mecha with one stab. The trembling MXD mecha swept over like a gust of wind. In less than a second, it had performed 14 consecutive microcontrols, entering the midsection of another Empire's mecha. With a heavy swing of its mechanical arm, the alloy blade sliced through the mecha's neck, pulling out the dense network of transmission wires and easily severing the mecha's power system. Chapter 518. Almost at the same time it finished off the second Imperial mecha, the white MXD mecha once again slid to the side. Unreasonably, it relied on its own weight and powerful inertia to ram viciously into the other Imperial mecha, sending it flying miserably. What was impossible to see with the naked eye was that in the instant this wolf mech flew off the ground and lost control, the white MXD's left alloy fist smashed down heavily, blasting a deep dent into the inside of the mech's mechanical leg. The severe physical deformation caused the balance support system hidden under the wolf mecha's baffle to explode. The mecha's body fell heavily onto the snowy ground, unable to stand up again. The fluid in the damaged pipes began to flow in reverse, and the delicate components were destroyed by the wanton flow of electricity. Immediately after that, the white MXD used the recoil from the collision to retreat at high speed. Its massive body did a somersault in midair that was absolutely forbidden in all mecha operating regulations. Its heavy and thick mechanical leg came crashing down like a long rock. Without giving the last Imperial mecha any chance to react, it simply and brutally trampled it to the ground. The white mecha crouched down, and the triangular alloy spear at the front of its right mechanical arm pierced through the weakest part of the Imperial mecha's cockpit. When it was pulled out, it left a trail of blood and sparks. The snow-white MXD mecha stood up silently in the dim light of the sky. Beneath its feet was the remains of an Empire mecha. This scene seemed to make the tragic battlefield in the snowy region quiet down a little .4 Wolf mecha surrounded and attacked. But their concentrated firepower did not harm Sulu at all. Instead, they were all easily one-shot by him. This was because the Federation's new MX mecha was already one level ahead of the Imperial mecha, and more importantly, because his control skills were already much better than these Imperial soldiers. He was one of the most outstanding mecha engineers in the Federation. His daily, tedious studies allowed him to understand the mecha structures of both sides like the back of his hand. At the same time, he was also the Federation's most talented mecha operator. This allowed him to target the weaknesses of the mecha, launching attacks from angles that the average person would never be able to imagine. Perhaps his current level of mecha control skills was still a considerable distance away from that old man and that uncle in Feiching, but this type of mecha combat concept design was already strong enough. At least on this planet 5460, he was unmatched. After a moment of silence on the battlefield, the final battalion of the Imperial Expeditionary Force did not stop moving forward because of the terrifying performance of this white Federation mecha. More armored vehicles and even more mecha came madly from all directions. In the cockpit, Shang Qiu stared through his glasses at the scrolling data on the screen and pressed the red button without hesitation. The white MXD mecha finally officially entered overclocking mode, charging straight into the dense tide of Imperial iron. because this was a mecha specially made for Sulu by the Nutshell Engineering Department. There was no more spectacular sight of the mecha taking off its armor. Only the roar of its twin engines and the violent tremors heralded the arrival of some sort of heroic scene. In the blink of an eye, the white mecha charged into the tide of Imperial iron. After a violent collision, a black shadow flew into the sky, and a low explosion rang out. Amidst the countless armored vehicles and mecha, the white mecha's silhouette seemed like it could collapse at any moment and be drowned out. But in the next instant, it miraculously stood up again. The triangular alloy spike was still shining brightly. 1 kilometer behind to the right, another white mecha was also maintaining a high-speed charging posture. Because most of the Imperial Empire's armored mobility forces had been drawn over by Sulu, the situation faced by Yulan and Xiong Linquan was much more relaxed. Today was the first time Xiong Linquan had witnessed Su Li's valiant style in mecha operation. Perhaps it was because he had been stunned by that scene, so he was not too worried about falling into the trap of being the leader of the iron flow of the Empire. But at this time, Yulan said coldly, "Pay attention, I want to get closer to boss." Xiong Linquan's body stiffened. He knew that Yulan was worried about the safety of the white mecha. He asked curiously, "Boss is such a strong guy. If he fought like before, he could definitely take on an entire Imperial mech squad by himself. What are you worried about?" One person taking on an entire Imperial mech squad by himself was something that only happened in legends. He wondered if the god of war, Li Pifu, could do it. Yulan thought about the experience of following Sulu all these years. She thought about how exhausted he looked after those intense mecha battles and said, "Boss is strong enough, but his endurance is not enough. He can't last long enough." Xiong Linquan immediately understood what she meant. His eyes widened as he watched the fierce battle. He shouted, "Then he really can't do it in bed. Let's go over and help him fuck a few more." Sula knew his problem better than Yulan. Intense battles drained the energy in his body. In previous battles, he had often encountered this problem. This problem was not just the unbearable hunger in his stomach, but also a matter of life and death. For example, last year at Yellow Mountain Ridge, when he had assisted the Iron 7 Division in the battle, he had single-handedly taken out around 10 Imperial mecha. But at that time, if the Iron 7 Division had not been there, he would not have been able to survive in his exhausted state. So now, he was very careful to avoid the dangerous situation of completely draining the energy in his body. In the previous battle, he had been forcefully pushing back his overclocked state. But today, in this snowy region filled with the desperate and frenzied atmosphere of the Imperial people, he had no other choice. He had to explode with all his energy and seek a good result of forcefully breaking through, or wait for the Green Dragon Mountain troops, who had been silent all this time, to react. The SCC system sent a synchronized signal. Sula said in a low voice, "Go away." A reply came from the other side. "Don't even think about it." Sulu wanted to rescue the trapped Green Dragon Mountain troops, but his subordinates and companions believed that his life and death were more important than anything else. This was not something that should happen on the battlefield, where discipline was the most important, but perhaps in the eyes of the 7th Division, this was a matter of course. The two white MXD mechas instantly drew close, maintaining a distance of 500 meters, and rushed towards the Imperial Expeditionary Force's mobile fleet. Those densely packed Imperial armored mobile fleet looked like a flattened cake. Su Li's white mecha was like a knife that had been stabbed into the center of the cake, while Yulan's mecha was treacherously waving around the edges of the cake, trying to share some of the pressure for him. It was a simple tactic, but it could also be said that there was no tactic. In reality, if these two MXD mechas wanted to break out of the encirclement other than courage and dominance, what else could they rely on? On the ground covered in deep snow, the two heavy white mechas broke through the snow at high speed. They were like two sharp and unstoppable lines of snow, extending forward. Although their speed had slowed down, they were still stubbornly extending forward. Other than the two sides engaged in fierce battle, the sporadic battles at the edge of the snowfield war zone all stopped almost at the same time. Regardless of whether it was the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers or the Imperial Expeditionary Force soldiers, they were all attracted by the two lines of snow. The highland with the geographical designation Y6328 in the charter was unremarkable in this snowfield of ice. Especially after being covered by the snowstorm, it was even more impossible to see any abnormalities. The trapped Green Dragon Mountain Troops headquarters was located in this highland in name. Deep snow covered the bottom of the barracks, and the bone-piercing cold made the atmosphere in the headquarters somewhat cold and cheerless. However, these soldiers who had persisted for 2 days and 1 night did not despair, and they did not give up. Because of the snowstorm and geomagnetic storm, the Green Dragon Mountain troops that had retreated slightly late were trapped in the snowfield. Then, they very unfortunately encountered the final madness of the Empire's people. Their battlefield command system had been severely damaged in the fierce battle, resulting in the current chaotic scene of the battlefield. If not for the bravery and inconceivable discipline of the Green Dragon Mountain troops at the grassroots level, this troop would probably have been defeated long ago. It was precisely because of this unique Green Dragon Mountain troops that could be called machinery and could also be called a great sense of discipline that the headquarters located at the edge of the battlefield did not even think of retreating early. From the regiment commander to the ordinary soldiers, they all firmly guarded this place, receiving wave after wave of attacks from the Empire's people while waiting for an opportunity to turn the tide. Unfortunately, 2 days and 1 night had passed, and the Federation's reinforcements still had not arrived. The geomagnetic storm also showed no signs of weakening, and this damned snowstorm was still so violent. A thick shadow shrouded the hearts of everyone in the headquarters. They even had no way of knowing the situation of the 2 battalions further away from the war zone. How should they fight this battle? Report. A scout covered in snow rushed into the headquarters and said loudly, "There are 2 Federation mecha coming. They should be reinforcements." The commander of the 1st Special Forces Advance Group, Li Ming, had sunken cheeks, the beard on his cheeks stiff. When he heard these words, his eyes narrowed slightly. He quickly walked out of the barracks and quickly asked, "How many reinforcements are there?" In his opinion, the 2 Federation mecha were definitely scouting or contact methods for the Federation's reinforcements. The true main force should be at the back. However, contrary to his expectations, that scout replied hesitantly, "Seems like it's just 2 mecha. I haven't discovered any traces of the main force." Commander Li Ming stopped his footsteps, a trace of confusion flashing through his eyes. Then, he picked up his electronic binoculars and looked towards the battlefield several kilometers away. The screen just happened to show the scene of 2 lines of snow charging straight towards the Empire's Armored Mobility Group. Commander Li Ming's eyes narrowed even more, becoming 2 thin lines in the blizzard. The Imperial Expeditionary Force besieging him had gathered the last of their strength. There were at least 30 wolf mecha. If it weren't for the fact that the Empire's commander would rather sacrifice the lives of normal soldiers than let the last mecha bear the threat of the magnetic storm bombs, his own troops might have long been reduced to more than 3,000 dead souls. How could 2 Federation mecha be a match for so many Empire mecha? Not staying silent for too long, Commander Li Ming said softly, "Gather formation and prepare to fire. Rescue those 2 young men." The chief of staff beside him stiffened slightly and protested emotionally. "Commander, this is the last of the electromagnetic ammunition equivalent. If we fire it out, what about those positions that don't have underground magnetic storm bombs? What about our soldiers? Even if we can successfully rescue these 2 mecha, we won't be able to change the overall situation at all. Don't tell me we have to die with these 2 mecha." Commander Li Ming quietly observed the wind and snow and said faintly, "Defending alone in a world of ice and snow for 2 days and 1 night. The Southern government has 2 divisions that are known to be the strongest, but in the end, only these 2 mecha came to save us. This reason is enough." Chapter 519. The sky had already darkened, and the snow had stopped. After the thick clouds, the sun had already set beside the ice peak. The last of the Green Dragon Mountain's ammunition had also been thrown out. Amidst the huge explosion, countless blue arcs of electricity sizzled, twisting and struggling to extend in all directions, landing on the alloy bodies of those Imperial mechas and armored vehicles. Like countless snakes that had suddenly awakened from hibernation, they attacked the enemy based on their biological instincts. Under the cover of this explosion, with the support of the Green Dragon Mountain troops, those two white Federation mecha that had come from afar finally managed to narrowly pass through the interception battle group that the Imperial Expeditionary Force had temporarily organized before they were on the verge of collapse. Diagonally, they passed through the three Green Dragon Mountain lines of defense and entered the command camp of this trapped army. Accompanied by the low sound of metal rubbing and liquid compressing, the cockpits of the two white mecha opened. Sulu and the other three climbed out, exhausted. Their bodies were more or less covered in wounds from the violent collisions. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers on the ground quickly came forward to receive them, carefully supporting these people who had come from afar as reinforcements. The officers and soldiers in the command center looked in shock at the terrible wounds on the two white mecha. Looking at the four drenched and haggard Federation soldiers, they easily associated it with the danger of the mecha's advance earlier. They couldn't help but secretly cheer for these people's courage and powerful combat strength. I am the commander of the advance team of the 1st Special Army, Li Ming. Commander Li Ming gripped Su Li's hand tightly and said with a smile, "Welcome, but I have some very bad news. Our regiment's last of the electromagnetic storm ammunition has already been thrown out. If those Imperial bastards throw their last mecha into battle, other than your two mecha, we have no other way." Sulu felt a warm feeling come from his palm. Glancing at the highest commander of the trapped army, he couldn't help but feel a trace of admiration for this commander's calm and steady attitude in such a desperate situation. "Our regiment has fought for 2 days and 1 night. We fought very badly." Commander Li Ming's smile gradually faded as he said calmly, "The command system is damaged. We can't get in touch with the two camps at the snowy peaks. We only know that the battle over there is still ongoing. I don't know how many soldiers have died, but if we don't have enough support, we won't be able to hold on much longer. In fact, I thought that no one would care about us." Commander Li Ming said, "I didn't expect that there would be 2 government mechas willing to accompany us on our last journey." Sulu could hear the slight bitterness and resentment in this Green Dragon Mountain commander's voice. If it had been him who had been besieged for 2 days and 1 night by the geomagnetic storms, snowstorms, and the crazy remnants of the Empire without seeing any Federation reinforcements or any possibility of escape, perhaps his resentment would be even deeper. "I believe that the big guys will definitely be able to hold on. The reinforcements from behind should be arriving soon." Sulu firmly shook the commander's hand and sincerely said, "Since we are here, the situation should be better." The soldiers of the Green Dragon Mountain Army had long been numbed by the blood coagulation and death in these 2 days and 1 night of battle. Hearing the words of this small-eyed Federation officer, they didn't have the energy to make an excited expression as a response. Instead, they felt somewhat disapproving and sorrowful ridicule in their hearts. They had seen with their own eyes those spectacular mecha assault scenes from before and were very impressed by these 4 Federation soldiers. However, they still did not believe that, faced with the ambush of an entire Imperial brigade, just these 2 Federation mecha would be able to save their own troops. This feeling instantly disappeared without a trace when Sulu said his next sentence. Expressions of shock appeared on the faces of the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers, somewhat unable to believe their own ears. "Let me introduce myself. I'm a technical director of the 17th Division, Sulu. These 2 are my subordinates. This one comes from a nutshell engineering department." The command center was silent for 2 seconds. Everyone looked at this pale-faced and tired Federation officer who didn't have a shred of outstanding features. They stared at those 2 small eyes in confusion. In their imagination, They placed a large pair of sunglasses on the bridge of this person's nose. Finally, they connected this person in front of them with that famous Federation war hero who often appeared on television. He was that Lieutenant Colonel Sulo? Commander Li Ming was slightly taken aback. Soon after, a bright light shone from his deep eye sockets. His gaze was filled with unconcealable joy. Because of decades of estrangement and war, there was an extremely deep enmity between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain. After 2 days and 1 night of desperate defense, he originally thought that the Federation had already given up on his troops. However, right now, when he saw this young officer in front of him, he suddenly felt as if he had been rescued from a hopeless situation. If this person in front of him really was that rumored Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, then the successor of the military god Li Pifu, the son-in-law of the Minister of Defense, the boyfriend of the nation's young lady, these wonderful yet chaotic identities, no matter which one was chosen, it was enough to make the Federation Command Center not dare to just watch him die. Commander Li Ming smiled slightly. He thought to himself that since this was the case, then right now, the other party was standing together with him, standing in his command center. This naturally meant that the command center would inevitably come to his aid. Send a special squad out. You have to find the liaison officer for me. Commander Li Ming took a deep breath and said sternly to his subordinates, "We are saved. He doesn't need to become a martyr." Liaison officer? Hearing this rare position in the army, Su Li's pupils shrank. He thought of the brother who had lost contact with him and quickly asked, "Sure Qinghai is in your troops?" Commander Li Ming was slightly startled and nodded. Through his introduction, Su Li found out that Mr. Sure had come to this Green Dragon Mountain troop from the West Woods as early as 3 months ago. He was in charge of the coordination work between the troops and the government army. This time, the advance group was surrounded by the Imperial Expeditionary Force, and Sure Qinghai was also trapped. After a day and a night of brutal battle, he left a letter casually saying that he was going to kill a few more Imperial officers to make his death more beautiful. Then, he took a box that never left his body and drifted away into the wind and snow. There's no need to send that squad out. Sula took a few quick breaths to calm his mind. Thinking of that guy's abilities, he shook his head and said, since he's going to kill snipers, no one can find him unless he wants to come back. He turned to look at Commander Li Ming and said, "Believe me, no one in this world knows his abilities better than I do. Comrade Commander, what we need to do now is to repair the command system as soon as possible. Please send out engineering personnel. We need to hurry." Commander Li Ming also didn't expect this second surprise. He frowned and glanced at the large mecha outside the barracks and said, "Where are the parts?" While they were talking, Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan had already opened Block 41 of the mecha's alloy outer armor. The hidden repair arm and fire control firmware had already been emptied, and some of the parts needed to repair the command system had been put in. Looks like the models aren't right. Some aren't parts at all. A certain senior engineer of the Green Dragon Mountain Advance Group had rushed excitedly to the snowy ground and then crouched down to count, but he came to a disappointed conclusion. Commander Li Ming glanced at Su Lu. Some of the models are correct. Of course, these parts aren't enough. Su Lu rested for a moment, and some of the strength in his body recovered. His pale complexion improved slightly, but the hunger in his stomach burned like a flame. "I need all the damaged armored vehicles here and all the automatic equipment not needed for battle. Also, if there's enough supplies, can you give me a few compressed energy bars?" "No problem." Commander Li Ming heard his strange request and smiled bitterly. At least the headquarters won't be too stingy in the area of food. But this way we can repair the command system. In the corner of the room, beside the pile of equipment that looked like scrap metal, Shang Qiu, who had already finished the initial inspection, stood up, took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose, rubbed between his eyebrows, and said calmly, "There's no problem. The nights in the Arctic glaciers of planet 5460 were always so long. Between the dark snowy plains and icy peaks, there were still sporadic battles going on. In the distance, there were faint sounds of explosions. However, under such a harsh environment, even the Empire's people, who were filled with suicidal madness, were unwilling to launch a large-scale attack. Behind the headquarters on the high ground, Su Lu and Shang Xiu were nervously and busily carrying out repair work with the assistance of the Green Dragon Mountain Mecha Repair Company soldiers. According to the list they had drawn up, there were many Green Dragon Mountain soldiers. Under the cover of the night, they were drilling into the damaged armored vehicles and self-propelled cannons around the defensive line, continuously dismantling and cutting them. Hundreds of parts that had passed the test and could still work were piled up in a corner. Su Lu and Shang Xiu stood in front of the open command system workbench, continuously communicating in low voices. As the developer, Shang Xiu was responsible for drawing up the blueprints and program plans, while Su Lu, who had been single-handedly trained by Feng Yu, was responsible for testing the replacement parts using the simple mechanic spirit of repairing mechas like a television. After watching for a long time, the soldiers of the Green Dragon Mountain Machine Repair Company, who had previously harbored doubts, finally admitted with shock that the brains of this young man and woman were as efficient and precise as a high-performance workbench. Furthermore, their talent in the area of machine repair was even more jaw-dropping. I say, brothers, who are these two people? The captain of the Mecha Repair Company stared somewhat absent-mindedly at that side. He took out a cigarette case and passed it to the two silent fellows beside him. He said in shock, "This boss of yours, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, is one of the developers of the MX Mecha. Everyone knows this. But where did this girl with an explosive figure come from?" Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan had been silently guarding beside Su Lu and Shang Xiu with their guns in their arms. After all, they were part of the proper government army. Even if they had done countless dirty and dark missions, under the influence of the Federation's propaganda and military culture, their disdain for the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army was difficult to erase. So at this time, when they heard the three words brothers and held between their fingers the number 37 brand cigarettes, they were actually somewhat unaccustomed to it. After pausing for a moment, they leaned over to the captain's lighter to light the cigarettes and took a deep drag. Xiong Linquan explained, "She is Shang Xiu, the first-level technical supervisor of Nutshell. She is the main developer of the MX Mecha. As for this broken command system, it just so happens that she was the one who designed it." The cigarette between the captain's lips suddenly dropped. He looked over there as if he had seen a ghost and said, "She is Shang Xiu? Our entire company's idol. She's actually so pretty?" You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.